There's nothing quite like playing a game multiple times through for hundreds of hours, analysing the captured gameplay footage for days, and writing a 38,000 word script to really make you hate a thing you love. Up until playing The Witcher 3 again for this video, I considered it my favourite game of all time. It's simultaneously a boring choice, being both a relatively recent and critically acclaimed game, and also a controversial choice given how flawed the experience is. But almost 5 years on, the memories of being immersed in the world, characters and stories were still fresh in my mind. The difference between my first playthrough in 2015 and subsequent ones in 2020 is that in the last 9 months I've read all 8 Witcher books and played over 100 hours of Witchers 1 and 2, and of course I've watched the television show. I then played The Witcher 3 again for a 100-hour playthrough plus a shorter abandoned third run, and spent weeks writing this script, recording audio and editing the video, not to mention having to specifically buy another hard drive because I had captured so much footage. I expected this process to at least take the edge off my admiration for the game, if not put me off the entire thing completely. And yet, The Witcher 3 is probably still my favourite game of all time. Although let's face it, trying to compare this to Celeste or The Outer Wilds is impossible and pointless. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend the entirety of this video praising the game. I haven't had a personality transplant. I'm still the same miserable bastard who finds plenty to hate in the things I love. You have to feel sorry for my wife, really. There's a little bit of housekeeping before I get into the meat of the video. In case you're wondering why the HUD looks a little different in my footage, it's because I used a mod to get the experience closer to what I wanted. I didn't use mods on the previous 2 games because I was trying to keep the whole experience as close to the original as possible. However, I've played Witcher 3 before with the default HUD and I absolutely hated it. Its HUD is the epitome of everything that is wrong with HUDs following the ubification of video games in the PS4 Xbox One generation. It is absolutely dire, and I didn't want to taint 100 plus hours of video footage with it. I've done you all a favour, trust me. I'll talk a little more about this mod and how it impacts navigation and the world as a whole later on in the video, but I just wanted to mention this now so you don't think about it for an hour. And here's your obvious spoiler warning for not just this game and the previous 2, but also the books and I suppose the TV show. If you don't know anything about Witcher 1 and 2, then I highly recommend you check out my videos on those first. However, if they are fairly fresh in your mind, then you should be able to keep up. There's no good way to avoid book spoilers, so if they are that important to you, then well, you should read the books and stop watching this video. If you want the too long didn't watch version of the video, then I must admit my opinion is much like the general consensus on the game. The combat is fine for an RPG, but not great on its own by any stretch. The map is far too cluttered with too much gear and nonsense to loot. It's best played on the hardest difficulty you can reasonably manage, and while the main story is okay, it's the side quests and overall quality of the writing that stand out. So yeah, that's the gist of it. Prepare yourselves for a couple of hours of opinions that you've already heard, except this time with a monotone British accent. Not only did revisiting The Witcher 3 not diminish my love of the game, it actually enhanced it because this time I set self-imposed rules that made the whole thing much more enjoyable. While my 2015 playthrough and 2020 playthrough both took roughly the same amount of time, they were vastly different experiences. Usually when making a video on a game, I'm inclined to do a thorough playthrough. One where I clear every item on the map, get all the collectibles, and generally just do everything the game has to offer. That's kind of what I did back in 2015. I investigated the vast majority of question marks on the map, I played Gwent and won the tournaments to get special cards, I did all the fist fighting competitions and entered the horse racing events. And unsurprisingly, I ran out of steam. By the time I hit roughly the 60 to 70 hour mark, I became desperate to see the end and move on to something else. I left a few monster contracts unresolved, didn't find all the Witcher gear, and started fast travelling everywhere to clear story quests as quickly as possible. Not this time. My 100-hour playthrough for this video didn't include any Gwent, fist fighting or horse racing other than when required or highly encouraged by the story. I filtered the map screen so that it wouldn't show question marks, monster nests or bandit camps. I didn't use fast travel at all except for mandatory travelling until roughly the 70-hour mark, and after then I did so sparingly. While I'm loath to tell you how to play a game, I strongly recommend you do something similar because I had a great time with this self-imposed rule set. I completed every monster contract, every treasure hunt and every side quest that wasn't related to Gwent, fist fighting or horse racing, and I did so without ever feeling even the slightest bit fatigued or ready to move on. I have never played a single playthrough of a single player game for 100 hours without feeling a wariness or general desire to get it over with. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever played 100 hours of a single player game in one playthrough. Being so engaged for so long speaks wonders of the quality on offer in The Witcher 3, and even though this video is going to veer into highly critical territory at times, it is important to always remember the overall sentiment I have towards this game, because CD Projekt Red deserves all the plaudits it received for this one, and it received a lot. Many of those plaudits were for the quality of the writing, and while I agree the writing is excellent, the main story does fall a little short. It's not bad by any stretch. There are a lot of great characters and important moments like major character deaths really hit home. There's humour to lighten the mood where appropriate, and character interactions are entertaining enough that I never found myself bored. I tried writing this script without including a straight up story summary, however I think it's better with one, especially given that everyone is going to have different levels of knowledge of the books and previous games. I know it's a bit dry, but the backstory is fairly complicated, and I'd wager there are a few people watching who've forgotten parts of it. As one character says in the books when Ciri's backstory is being explained, quote, "Only the devil himself could grasp all this. You are all entangled, knotted and mixed up. It's too much for my head." Close quote. I'll try and keep it brief, but if you want to skip all the factual story stuff, then click ahead to the time on screen now. Most of the story is the hunt for Ciri, or perhaps more accurately, a hunt for people who have seen Ciri. Through their stories, told via flashbacks, we piece together Ciri's story since she returned to this realm while being chased by a spectral group of elves known as the Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt are chasing Ciri for her power, which will enable the Wild Hunt to leave their own dying world for this one. That's the short explanation anyway. For a more long-winded one, we need to look to the books. Ciri is a descendant of Lara Dorren, a powerful elven sorceress who carried the Elder Blood, which in turn makes Ciri a child of the Elder Blood, aka Elven Blood. Ithilne's prophecy states that a child of the Elder Blood will save elves from annihilation. However, Lara Dorren, seemingly the only carrier, had a child with a human, and it was thought this broke the prophecy. Ciri is thought to be the only surviving child of the Elder Blood. Not every descendant carries the Elder Blood, and it lies latent in many, so it is perhaps possible others are out there, or that it could return without Ciri. However, that's outside the scope of this story. It's a complicated family tree with more than a hint of incest for good measure. As for what the Elder Blood actually is, well, that's a little more complicated. A note within The Witcher 3 states that it may be a type of curse, probably because few with the blood have the ability to control its power, which then results in destruction and death. The power, when properly harnessed, grants control over time and space, and in the book Ciri used this to travel between worlds. Whatever it is, it appears to be a creation of elven mages who wanted to create people even more powerful than themselves. As if Elder Blood didn't already make Ciri special, she was also a princess of Sintra. Her mother, Pavetta, also a child of the Elder Blood, married a man known as Dunny, who when they met was suffering a curse that made him half hedgehog. Pavetta's love of Dunny cures the curse and he becomes fully human again. Dunny was actually entitled to be Pavetta's husband anyway through the law of surprise. He saved Pavetta's father years ago, but it always helps when both parties are actually in love. Before he can marry Pavetta, Geralt saves Dunny's life when Pavetta's mum, Queen Calanthe, decides she really doesn't want her daughter, and heir to the throne, marrying a hedgehog. As his reward, Geralt claims the law of surprise because he knows Pavetta is pregnant, and Dunny, who doesn't know he is soon to be a father, quickly agrees. This was changed a bit in the TV series, which portrayed Geralt as being ignorant of Pavetta's pregnancy and somewhat annoyed that he now had a surprise child to worry about. As you likely know, the law of surprise states that payment will be that which you don't know you have. This means Geralt and Ciri, when she's born, will be forever bonded. The way Dunny's curse is lifted through Pavetta's love is obviously reminiscent of fairy tales, however this one soon turns dark. As a child, Dunny was the son of the Emperor of Nilfgaard, but there was a coup and he was locked up and cursed. After marrying Pavetta, a mage called Vilgefortz offered Dunny a deal that would have seen Dunny take back the throne of Nilfgaard in exchange for Vilgefortz getting the throne of the North. Vilgefortz believed in the Elder Blood prophecy and wanted Ciri under his control, and obviously Dunny wanted what he saw as his rightful title of Emperor. However, Dunny and Pavetta were heirs to the Cintran throne and couldn't just run away. Vilgefortz planned a fake shipwreck to make it look like Dunny, Pavetta and Ciri had died, whereas in reality they were to be teleported to safety by the mage. Pavetta found out about the plan and secretly stashed Ciri with crack on crate just before the ship left Skellige. Dunny found out Ciri had been left behind during the voyage and fought with Pavetta, accidentally sending her overboard where she drowned. Dunny was successfully teleported to Nilfgaard and presumed dead by those in the north. He took the name Emir and ended up becoming the Emperor of Nilfgaard. Meanwhile, Ciri made her way back to Sintra to live with her grandmother. A few years later, she ran away from home after deciding she didn't much care for the match her grandmother had made for her. While in the dangerous Brocadon forest, she met Geralt, who keeps her safe, and eventually he realises she is the child of Surprise he claimed ownership of about 10 years ago. Still, at this point, he figures she would be better off at home, so he leaves her with Mousesack, a trusted advisor, who takes her back to Sintra. Unfortunately, Ciri isn't safe in Sintra either. Nilfgaard under Emir takes Sintra by force, killing Ciri's grandmother in the process. Emir wants to cement his claim over the land by marrying the heir, which is of course Ciri, his daughter. Ciri, thankfully, is missing. After the Battle of Sintra, she ran away and ended up in the home of a woman called Golden Cheeks. Ciri lived with Golden Cheeks for about 6 months and helped out with chores in the absence of Golden Cheeks' husband, who was away. By coincidence, or destiny if you like, Geralt happens to save the life of the husband and claims the Law of Surprise as his reward. The husband is surprised to find Ciri at home when he gets back, and Geralt can no longer deny that destiny has tied the two of them together. He brings Ciri back to Kaer Morhen to train her to be a Witcher. Witchers are all men who grew up exclusively around men, so they were always likely to need a little help when bringing up a girl. All the more so when the girl in question has elder blood. After Ciri started spouting prophecy, the Witchers asked Triss and Yennefer to help, with Yen in particular playing a huge role in Ciri's upbringing. Ciri was to be officially enrolled as a student of magic at a conference of mages. While there, the conference was attacked by Vilgefortz, who tried to capture Ciri. She escaped through a portal and ended up in a desert where she met a unicorn that she called Little Horse, and yes, I swear this all actually happened in the book, as crazy as it sounds. Ciri then falls in with a bad crowd, to say the least, and is raped and beaten multiple times before finding safety and making it to the Tower of Swallows, which teleports her to the world of the NL Elves. The NL are different from the N Shade Elves who inhabit Geralt's world, although they are descended from the same line, with the NL having left the continent to travel to a different world. The NL Elves are the race that Lara Dorren once belonged to, and when they find Ciri, they take her captive and try to get their ruler to impregnate her. They see this as reclaiming the bloodline after it was dirtied by humans. The bloodline will never be fully elven again, but they believe that by bringing up Ciri's child as one of them and then presumably keeping the bloodline within the NL going forward, it will at least be close enough. One of the key players in all this is an elf called Avalak, who promises to let Ciri go once she's given birth, although it's later revealed that he was lying. Fortunately for Ciri, Oberon, the ruler who is supposed to impregnate her, appears neither willing nor able to do the job. Unfortunately for Ciri, Oberon doesn't live much longer. He dies after drinking too much of a special tonic that is supposed to help him impregnate Ciri. This was probably murder by poison, but the books leave it vague. In The Witcher 3 we see that he was killed by another powerful NL called Eredin, who poisoned the tonic and tried to take Ciri for himself. The unicorns of this world, of whom Little Horse was one, are at war with the NL, and again I swear I'm not making this up. They help Ciri escape back to her own world, although not without a few detours on the way. Ciri reunites with Geralt and Yennefer and also meets her father, Emir. The story in the books ends with Geralt's death to an angry peasant wielding a pitchfork. Ciri transports Geralt and Yennefer to the Isle of Avalon. That's it for the books, but as we know it doesn't end there. In The Witcher 2, Letho filled in a few gaps in Geralt's memory by explaining how Geralt left the island to retrieve Yennefer from the Wild Hunt and ended up joining them in exchange for her release. He then somehow got dumped near Kaer Morhen with no memory. The Witcher 3 reveals that it was Ciri who rescued Geralt from the Wild Hunt and left him near his Witcher base. She'd been world hopping after being spotted by the Wild Hunt and rescued Geralt once she found out he was effectively their prisoner. Shortly after that she reunites with Avalak and she trusts him despite him previously lying about keeping her prisoner. It's a bit of an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, at least at first. Avalak fell out with Eredin after finding out Eredin killed Oberon, and Eredin inflicted a curse upon Avalak that is transforming him into a hideous beast, hence he wears a mask. Avalak helps Ciri out a lot and likely saves her life multiple times as she runs from the Wild Hunt, although make no mistake his motivations aren't entirely pure. He's obsessed with Lara Dorren's bloodline and will do anything to see it continue. Still, this aligns with the general goal of keeping Ciri alive, so we can live with that. Ciri and Avalak end up back in Skellige and create quite a commotion by dropping out of the sky. Everything from this point on is in the game and we see it by way of flashbacks. The Wild Hunt finds Ciri and Avalak in Skellige, so they teleport away and are split up in the process. Ciri ends up in Crookback Bog and meets the local witches, but runs away after realising they plan to use her elder blood for nefarious means. She meets a young girl called Gretka in the woods and ends up back with the Bloody Baron. After using her powers to save the Baron, Ciri realises the Wild Hunt will pick up her trail, so she leaves and heads back to Novigrad to meet Dandelion. She needs help to fix a phylactery, which kind of sounds like a contraceptive, but is actually a device that will cure Avalak's curse. This gets Ciri involved in a scheme to rob a bank, and she disappears after being captured by guards. She ends up back in Skellige, where she is looked after by a young man called Skarl. The village is then attacked by the Wild Hunt, so she runs away again and meets up with Avalak, who is about to transform because of the curse. Before that happens, he effectively puts Ciri into a coma and hides her in a place called the Isle of Mists, so that the Wild Hunt can't find her. Avalak then completes his transformation into this little guy, who's affectionately known as Uma. And that about brings us up to date with where the game starts. Geralt follows leads, speaking to the Bloody Baron, Dandelion, Skarl and many more to get the full story about Ciri, at which point he realises Uma is actually Avalak and takes him back to Kaer Morhen. Using a procedure similar to that inflicted on young boys who wanted to become witches, called the Trial of Grasses, the witches transform Uma back into Avalak, who tells them Ciri is on the Isle of Mists. Geralt heads back to the Isle of Mists, and in one of the less subtle fairy tale references, he finds Ciri with 7 dwarves who have been looking after her. The sleeping spell Avalak used was so strong they thought she was dead, however she does of course wake up and tells Geralt her incredible story. This journey to find Ciri is a huge part of the game in terms of the time it takes to get here. Ciri wasn't an easy woman to find, but the main event is yet to come. Ciri teleports to Kaer Morhen for an emotional reunion with Vesemir and co, before they all prepare for the inevitable appearance from the Wild Hunt. This bit is excellent because you get to wander around the exact same location from the prologue of the first game and see it in all its glory. The Witchers didn't quite get around to patching up all the damage from that earlier attack, but it's great to have this series begin and almost end in the same place. Despite everyone's best efforts, the Wild Hunt breaks through, and Imlerith, a senior member of the Wild Hunt, grabs Vesemir as a hostage to force Ciri to go with them. In one of the best scenes of the game, Vesemir, realising that Ciri will surrender to save his life, sacrifices himself by attacking Imlerith, which forces him to execute Vesemir.
Ciri, no! I forbid you! You always were an unruly child. I adored that about you. Now fly!
Vesemir's death unleashes a powerful rage from within Ciri, much like her mother did all those years ago, which you might have seen in the television show, and this sends the Wild Hunt fleeing. Ciri is fed up of being chased and is ready to take the battle to the Wild Hunt. Ciri kills some witches while Geralt kills Imlerith to avenge Vesemir. After finding a device called a Sunstone, Geralt and co spring a trap on the Wild Hunt and go on the offensive. Geralt fights and kills Eredin, but Ciri disappears and all hell breaks loose as another conjunction of these spheres, the event that brought monsters into this world to begin with, once again sows chaos and destruction. Geralt makes it to the epicentre where Ciri and Avalak have opened a portal. Ciri jumps through the portal, stating it is the only way to stop the White Frost that threatens the entire world. Ciri is successful in stopping the White Frost, but there are 3 different epilogues and which one you get depends on Geralt's relationship with Ciri. I've seen both of the good endings, which see Ciri either become a Witcher with Geralt or have her take her place as the heir to Nilfgaard. However, she can also die in her effort to stop the White Frost. That's it then for the straight up story description. As you can imagine, I have things to say. Let's start with that ending. If you've played the game or how even just listened to the summary I gave, you may have noticed that the Wild Hunt pop up quite often and are presented as the main threat. Plus, the game is called The Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt. If the Wild Hunt gain control of Ciri's power, they will open up a portal and let all their people through, decimating this world and claiming it as their own. So with that in mind, you might have reasonably expected the conclusion to centre around defeating the Wild Hunt and not the White Frost, which in my summary only came up right at the end and for good reason. During the game, the White Frost, on the rare occasions it is mentioned, is treated as a distant threat, not an imminent one. And yet the final climactic moments see Ciri potentially sacrifice her life for this vague threat. There are mentions of the White Frost during the game, such as when a fortune teller reads Geralt's future, and of course it's long been part of Ifaline's prophecy that the child of the Elder Blood is destined to prevent the White Frost. However, that has always felt like a problem for the future, and all the way up until the ending of my first playthrough back in 2015, I felt certain that the White Frost was effectively sequel bait for a Witcher 4 or a Ciri spin-off. I was sure the game would end with Geralt and Ciri defeating the Wild Hunt, and there would be some dramatic scene like Eredin with his dying words telling us how we haven't won, we've only delayed the inevitable, you can't stop the White Frost, that kind of thing. Or it could be an epilogue or post-credits scene. I certainly didn't expect the White Frost to be dealt with almost as an afterthought at the end of this game. That feeling was even more pronounced on a second playthrough. All my time with the books built up the prophecy. I read about Ciri coming into her power and then disappearing. In the games, Geralt fought Jack de Aldersberg, who'd warned about an oncoming ice age, and there are references to the White Frost in this game, but it felt like a big tease for a fourth game. The White Frost prophecy has changed a little from the books, or at least how I understood the prophecy in the books. These things are always a bit vague, I suppose. I thought the White Frost was only a danger to Geralt's world, whereas now it seems to be a threat to all worlds and has already hit the world of the Wild Hunt. I also thought it was supposed to be Ciri's child who would eventually defeat the White Frost, not Ciri herself. My suspicion is that CD Projekt Red didn't always intend to end the story this way and added it in either to create a fitting climax to Ciri's story, which would have otherwise ended with a bit of a whimper with Geralt taking all the glory, or simply to close off the story and not leave people hanging on a fourth game that would have been, 10 years away, if it ever happened at all. As for those alternate endings and the choices that lead to them, well, I have to say I'm fairly happy with how they're handled. None of the endings are bad in terms of quality, although obviously Ciri dying would constitute a sad ending, or bad as in non-ideal. As a resolution to the story though, I think they all do the job. I also like how the choices factor into what ending you get. There are no obvious moments where it's clear you're making a huge ending defining decision. Likewise, the endings aren't a reward for being good. They aren't tied to how many people you helped or what you did with the Bloody Baron. Whereas Ciri lives or dies is determined by the closeness of her relationship to Geralt, which in turn is determined by how he acts in scenes with her. For example, when visiting Avalak's lair, Ciri finds evidence that Avalak is obsessed with her bloodline, and she's annoyed at having been effectively part of a science experiment. Geralt can either calm her down or help her destroy the place. I thought it was just a fun cutscene and I had no idea I was making a big choice, but if you help her destroy the place then your relationship with her will deepen. Now, quite why these moments help her survive is a bit of a mystery. I guess her affection for Geralt gives her the strength to defeat the White Frost and return alive. It's a bit wishy-washy, I admit, but it's better than so many alternatives. As for whether she ends up becoming a Witcher or the heir to the Nilfgaardian throne, that decision makes a lot more sense, although again I doubt you'll know it at the time. The deciding factor here is whether Geralt takes Ciri to visit Emhyr just before the final battle. He was the one who originally hired Geralt to look for Ciri, even if Geralt would have done that anyway, and he'll pay you the full fee if you let him. However, accepting payment affects your relationship with Ciri. Anyway, during this visit, Ciri and Emhyr talk alone, and I guess this is enough to have Ciri agree to become Nilfgaardian royalty at the end. This might seem like a dark ending, given that Nilfgaard is always portrayed as the villain. However, I'd say it's not quite as bad as it seems. First, it meant that Geralt and Yennefer, in my case, were able to go off and live happily ever after as a couple and didn't need to worry about Ciri. Second, I'd like to think that once Ciri takes the throne, she will be a much more peaceful and benevolent ruler than Emhyr. And maybe, just maybe, the bloodshed can end. Finally, with regards to Nilfgaard and the war, the damage has likely already been done. Depending on your actions in certain major side quests that I'll discuss later, you may have already effectively ceded the north to Nilfgaard, and if you haven't, I hate to use cliches like both sides are equally bad and all that nonsense, but it does slightly feel that way. I still consider Nilfgaard the enemy. They were the invading force, and if we include the events of Thronebreaker, we see them commit some hideous acts. However, Radovid and many other kings in Temeria before him were also terrible and undeserving of sympathy. There are a few attempts at humanising Nilfgaardian soldiers throughout the game as well, such as the one who helps a Temerian soldier hide after battle and ends up abandoning Nilfgaard to work with the Temerian soldier. It should also be noted that Nilfgaard is a lot more tolerant of non-humans than the North is. Let's face it though, while the future of the kingdom is a big deal, Geralt's most important and arguably hardest choice is to somehow pick between Triss and Yen. I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of experience picking between stunningly beautiful, powerful women, so on my first playthrough I ended up at a bit of an impasse and tried to have them both. I assumed these modern, enlightened women would be up for sharing, but they weren't. Besides the fact that both women are attractive and can probably use magic to do things I've never even dreamed of, the decision was tough because I was torn between my own desires and Geralt's. Although The Witcher 3 is an RPG, we are role-playing as Geralt and not a free-form character that can match our own personality. While that can sound restrictive, it also has some huge advantages. I tend to role-play as an incredibly soft character who doesn't murder even those who frankly deserve it. Geralt though doesn't have those qualms, and that gave me more freedom in some ways. For example, by murdering Whoreson in cold blood, which I'm fairly sure Geralt would have done, bearing in mind he was surrounded by tortured and murdered women at the time. That said, when it comes to forming close personal relationships and having sex on stuffed unicorns, I think there's a tendency to let our own feelings take over slightly, regardless of how much we are trying to roleplay as someone else. Personally, I prefer Triss. She's a big part of all 3 games and helped Geralt with his memory loss even though she knew that wouldn't necessarily work to her benefit. She is largely selfless and risks her own life for others on a regular basis. And she's a redhead. There's a nice callback to The Witcher 2 with the Rose of Remembrance that you can find in Triss's room. However, it only hit me a few hours later that in The Witcher 2 save file I was using, I hadn't actually given Triss the rose. Turns out she has it here regardless of what you did in Witcher 2. In The Witcher 3, Geralt will likely do Triss's questline before seeing much of Yennefer beyond an initial cold introduction. In addition to helping other mages escape the city, Triss also takes you to a fancy evening ball where she gets a little tipsy, and in my case, her and Geralt kiss. By contrast, Yennefer can be quite cold. It's not fair to say she doesn't care about others, but she will happily sacrifice lives for what she sees as the greater good. She uses up all the magic in a holy site to bring a man back from the dead even though he's clearly in pain, and she barely bats an eyelid. She's the sort of person who wouldn't hesitate for a moment when faced with the trolley problem and wouldn't feel the slightest twinge of guilt about those who died, because she knows deep down she did the right thing. Yennefer is also temperamental and keeps Geralt in the dark, treating him like a child. Quite a few of the side characters, like Ceres for example, remark on how Geralt is basically under Yennefer's spell. And you get the distinct impression that if Geralt wasn't so powerful himself, people would talk about the relationship as being borderline abusive. Despite all that, I went with Yennefer this time around because I was doing my best to roleplay specifically as Geralt, and I really think he would have picked Yen. Whether I would make the same choice felt besides the point. Oh, and I absolutely love the conversation between Geralt and Vesemir about how Yennefer got rid of Geralt's bed when she arrived at Kaer Morhen.
She teleports in, not even a nice to see, jumps right into a we've a curse to lift, there's this to do and that. So Eskel and Lambert get going. Then she went to the guest room to rearrange things, threw the bed off the balcony.
Shame. That was a good bed.
Said the same myself. Solid oak frame, down mattress. Triss always said she... Ah, now I see.
It's either that, or Yen really hates oak furniture. So upset about Triss, you gotta take it out on the furniture?
Would you prefer I take it out some other way? Geralt, I don't want to seem like a vindictive shrew, but that very bed is where you just happened to fuck a dear friend of mine. Yes, I know, you'd lost your memory. Whatever.
For those of you who haven't read the books, it really is hard to overstate the powerful connection between Geralt and Yennefer. Geralt and Yen first meet in one of Sapkowski's short stories, The Last Wish, in which they encounter a djinn, basically an evil genie, and Geralt is forced to make his third and last wish to stop the djinn causing more chaos. He wishes for Yennefer's fate to be connected to his for eternity, which to be honest is a strange wish to make for a woman you've just met, but deep down I guess Geralt is a romantic. He was partly motivated by knowing that Yennefer was once a hunchback, but I don't really get the leap to then connecting himself to her for all eternity. After this, the two of them spend a lot of time apart in the books. Yennefer is far from ever present, and Geralt in particular isn't shy about fulfilling his needs elsewhere. However, when they are together, the tension is generally off the scale, and they argue in a way that only people in love can. When Geralt is killed by a random wielding a pitchfork, Yennefer sacrifices her own life in an attempt to save him, and Ciri takes them both to the Isle of Avalon where they can spend eternity together. We weren't told the name of this island in the books, but the third game names it Avalon, which presumably confirms that it is the isle of the same name from Arthurian legend. At some point the Wild Hunt show up on the island and capture Yen, forcing Geralt to give chase. I got the impression that he wasn't supposed to be able to leave this island without special powers like those possessed by Ciri, but somehow he does. I don't think this is ever explained. Geralt finds the Wild Hunt and agrees to join them if they let Yennefer go. While this part of the story sounds incredibly interesting, we never see much of it play out other than the static images in The Witcher 2. They have a lot of history, and now I know that history I had to pick Yen for Geralt even though I didn't like her that much. Their quest together is called The Last Wish, much more than a wink and a nod to Sapkowski's story. Yen knows that Geralt's last wish back in that original story was for the two of them to be bound together forever, and she wants to know whether that is why they still share a close bond or whether they actually have feelings for each other. Yen forces a Jinn to remove the link and then asks Geralt whether he still wants to be with her. Geralt says yes, and according to my ending of the story at least, it does look like the two of them will live happily ever after. Of course, the most important woman in Geralt's life is actually Ciri. Even though Ciri is essentially a chosen one, the story isn't told from the perspective of the chosen one, which makes her feel surprisingly refreshing for such a powerful hero. Ciri's playable quests aren't all that interesting, however as a character she is fantastic. During the flashbacks you can see how she charms everyone she meets, and the moment she realises she's put people in danger she moves on. There's an excellent optional quest line with Ciri near the end, which is basically just travelling to a bunch of places for conversations, and yet it does a great job showing what makes these games great. Have you ever been playing a game or watching a film or TV show or reading a book for that matter, where you followed the hero of the story on their adventure and then taken a moment to think about the people who die on their journey? The random townsfolk who take someone in only to be brutally killed as punishment for helping, or the people who agree to join a battle and promptly die before we even have a chance to learn their name. I find myself thinking about those people more and more these days. Maybe it's just a remnant of that Austin Powers bit where they show what life is like for the families of the henchmen. Anyway, Ciri thinks about those people. She asks after the Bloody Baron and is saddened to hear that he died by suicide, and she visits a tavern to repay a woman who helped her while she was on the run. Most notably though, she wants to hear what happened to Skarl, and it's a sad story. Skarl helped Ciri escape from the Wild Hunt after she'd spent some time in the sauna to recover from serious injuries. He clearly had a crush on Ciri, and she liked him even though her preferences lay elsewhere. Skarl led the Wild Hunt away as Ciri escaped with Avalak, but he was killed in the process. The worst part is that his fellow villagers proceeded to nickname him Craven and refused to give him a proper burial because they thought he ran away when the Wild Hunt attacked, when in fact he sacrificed his own life for Ciri. Yennefer is able to bring Skarl back to life long enough to get the true story, and an incredibly convenient link to Uma. So when Ciri asks to see him again, Geralt is at least able to take her to his body and give him a proper burial. It's a nice moment, and while this quest could easily feel like padding and a waste of time, I'd argue it's essential to that feeling of playing in a real world with real people and real consequences. Ciri might be a literal chosen one, and she does end up saving the world, but whether deliberately or not, people die because of her actions, and she doesn't forget that. Outside of the main cast, Zoltan continues to be a source of comic relief, and of all the book characters to pop up in the games in smaller roles, he's probably had the best treatment over the trilogy. The same can't be said for Dandelion, who I don't think CD Projekt Red ever quite got right. It's not so much that the character feels off or different compared to the books. He is the cheeky and charismatic guy he's portrayed as, and he manages to get himself into more than his fair share of mischief. It's that the relationship between Dandelion and Geralt isn't quite right, because Dandelion is just another quest giver like Zoltan. In the books, Dandelion is much closer to an ever-present companion for Geralt. There's a reason the narration of the story is often framed through Dandelion, and in the books he writes a history of events because he was so close to all the major characters. An older version of Dandelion narrates events on the loading screens as well, so he clearly writes this story in the future, even if he isn't there for most of it. I love these short little summaries, by the way. While it wasn't a problem for me this time around, I do often go a week or so, if not longer, without playing a game, and I lose track of where I am and what I'm supposed to do. Having Dandelion act as a constant companion was probably too difficult for CD Projekt Red to replicate in the game. Having a companion in an open world game would be a big ask, not only in terms of having him always by Geralt's side as he travels around, but having all the extra dialogue that would be required for general banter and for him to take part in conversations. Even so, I wish Dandelion played a bigger role. Perhaps he could accompany Geralt more in Novigrad instead of being missing for most of the time. He does have a quest where he opens a burlesque house, but even that involves Geralt working on his own a lot. For the most part, however, I was just overjoyed to see so many book characters take part in this series, and for so many of them to be done justice. I can only imagine what it was like for people who read the books first many years ago and then played the games as they were released. The closest I will get to such an experience is if they ever make a decent series of games based on the Mistborn novels. The characters are brought to life with some phenomenal voice acting. It's incredible to think how far we've come from games like Oblivion, where there were only about 12 actors doing all the roles. I'm sure there's some overlap here as well, but you can't tell. The quality is so high across the board. The main cast is of course excellent, but minor characters like Johnny the Godling also get brought to life with some excellent writing and delivery. He's actually one of my favourite characters in the series now, just based off his appearances in this game.
I helped you, now you help me.
Would you turn this beautiful act of altruism into a banal bartering of favours? Did I ever? Remember it as if it were yesterday. Soon as I woke, I went to empty my bowels. My favourite part of the day. Defecating to the sunrise. Downright glorious.
Not every line is perfectly delivered. There are a few that sound like the actor didn't quite know the context of what he was saying, and some bad takes do seem to have crept in. However, those lines are few and far between.
It was me. You do it? You's a witcher, is you not? Straight off. A picture in me granny's book.
While CD Projekt Red does justice to most of the characters and events in the books, there are a few parts where they didn't get the continuity quite right, especially in the opening. The prologue works well as a tutorial to the game's systems and open world, giving you a mini world to wander around in and teaching you how witchers go about fighting monsters. As a story prologue, however, it doesn't exactly pull you in. I thought much the same thing when I first played the game in 2015, and I assumed that was because I hadn't played the first two games or read the books. In those circumstances, it's reasonable or even expected to be a little off the pace. I considered it a me problem and not a game problem. However, having now played and read all the games and books, I still find the opening underwhelming and a little baffling. It feels like CD Projekt Red was being pulled in 3 different directions, and continuity between the previous games and books becomes a huge problem. On the one hand, The Witcher 3 was the first game to be released across all 3 major platforms, with the first game only appearing on PC, and the sequel restricted to PC and Xbox 360. CD Projekt Red clearly couldn't ignore the huge PS4 install base, but was faced with the problem of millions of new players coming in who knew little or nothing about the world or characters. In addition, there were a few million people who had played either one of or both of the previous 2 games and wanted to see Geralt's story from those games continue. And finally, there were those who had read the books and wanted to see that world accurately represented with deep callbacks and references. In the end, CD Projekt Red struggled to keep any of these groups entirely happy, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the opening. I left out the opening in my story summary because it isn't that important, but to quickly summarise, Geralt is heading to a meeting with Yennefer, who got in touch via a letter smelling strongly of lilac and gooseberries, Yennefer's distinctive scent. They meet up and Yennefer takes Geralt to Emir, the Emperor of Nilfgaard, who tells Geralt that the Emperor's daughter Ciri is missing and instructs Geralt and Yennefer to find her. Those who haven't read the books will likely be left confused and generally a bit apathetic about this premise. As discussed in my videos, the previous 2 games barely acknowledged the existence of Yen and Ciri, initially excused by Geralt's memory loss and later just sort of hand-waved away. If CD Projekt Red always planned to bring Yen and Ciri into the story, it certainly didn't do a good job setting them up for people who had played the previous 2 games. And that wouldn't be so bad if CD Projekt Red was just catering to book fans with this opening. But it holds back slightly with these characters, presumably in an attempt to avoid alienating its new audience. The result is a disappointment for fans of the books and fans of the games, while not being anything special for new players either. I can only imagine how excited book readers would have been for the reunion of Yennefer and Geralt, and yet when they do meet, Geralt's reaction makes you wonder whether he's still suffering from memory loss. There's no chemistry between the 2 of them, and while part of that reaction can be explained by Geralt's annoyance at Yen seemingly working for Nilfgaard, that doesn't justify the complete lack of emotion from both of them. Geralt hasn't seen Yennefer for years at this point, however he does remember their time together and his feelings for her, and yet they greet each other like exes who don't like each other all that much but have to be civil in public around mutual friends. The game does a better job establishing Geralt's relationship with Ciri thanks to a tutorial flashback to the time she spent at Kaer Morhen, and Geralt and Vesemir talk about her like proud parents. You can at least appreciate there's a lot of history between them. Sure, a new player isn't going to have exactly the same reaction to Ciri as someone who has read the books, but they will at least know what they are supposed to feel for Ciri. With Yen, it's a little ambiguous. The introduction of Emir, the Emperor of Nilfgaard, also presents some continuity issues, and I never felt like this Emir was the Emir of the books. Emir hears the rumours about Ciri returning to this realm, and he is Ciri's natural father, so he asks Geralt to find her. If you haven't read the books, this isn't a big deal. Sure, Geralt isn't supposed to get involved in wars, but Geralt is close to Ciri as well, so he might as well agree to get paid for what he would likely do anyway. Now that I've read the books, I am somewhat amazed that Geralt and Yennefer would have anything to do with Emir. Emir might well be Ciri's biological father, however he also invaded her hometown of Sintra, killing Ciri's grandmother and nearly Ciri herself in the process. There is then the small matter of him trying to marry her. The father wanted to marry the daughter simply to help secure the throne of Sintra. This man is not sympathetic or deserving of Geralt's time. He ends up marrying a woman who looks like Ciri and does fall in love with this body double, although she's nowhere to be seen in this game. Another continuity issue is that in the books it wasn't common knowledge that Ciri was Emir's daughter, otherwise a few people might have raised eyebrows at the whole incest thing. In the game this seems to be common knowledge and likely explains why his fake Ciri wife is not mentioned. To be fair, a lack of continuity between the books and the games is understandable, especially when it comes to characters. Characters are shaped not just by their actions but by the writing that describes those actions, and the thought processes that lead to them. Not to mention the reactions of other characters in the story, which can shape your own as the reader. Just because Geralt thinks one way about a character doesn't mean he is necessarily correct. As a reader, your own opinions of characters are shaped by the reactions of other characters, especially protagonists. A change of writers, as clearly happened between the books and the games, is going to lead to inconsistencies in how characters are presented. What's less understandable is a lack of continuity from one game to another, and you can see CD Projekt Red really struggle to wrap up the loose ends and bring forward stories from the previous games. The most glaring example is the omission of Yorveth, who played a huge role in the second game, although the exact scale of his role there did depend on the choices you made. For my main playthrough in The Witcher 3, I carried forward the ending of The Witcher 2 where I worked with Yorveth and his Scoia'tael freedom fighters instead of Roach. Geralt and Yorveth became friends, and Yorveth clearly respected Geralt at the end. Yorveth also served as your connection to the downtrodden elves who are sidelined in this story. Yorveth is nowhere to be seen. It's widely believed that Yorveth was going to be in the third game and that he was later cut out. However, the only sources I can find are random forum posts that are supposedly by a developer at CD Projekt Red. I'm inclined to believe them though, especially because there are areas in the game you're never sent to that likely relate to Yorveth's quests. Apparently Yorveth would have played a small role in quests around Novigrad when you first arrived there, and would have had a larger story centred around finding a cure for the plague currently spreading throughout Velen. I'm gutted that we didn't get this quest, not just because I believe Yorveth should have been in the game somewhere, but because another forgotten element of the previous games is the plague that was the centre of the entire story in the first game, and then completely forgotten about. Vizima was quarantined for large parts of the game because of the plague, and we were told that it was spreading and decimating the entire continent. There are references to the plague in the game, such as Kira Metz crediting the witches of Crookback Bog with having helped stop the spread of the plague in Velen, but that's all they are, references. The major cause of economic strife in Velen is the war that has ravished the region following the invasion of Nilfgaard, not the plague. The inclusion of this Yorveth story would have gone some way to rectifying that problem. While Yorveth was cut, Roach does return, which I suspect means more people took the Roach path in Witcher 2, although Roach does work with Geralt even if Geralt sides with Yorveth, so it's fair to say that more people would remember Roach. There are plenty of other abandoned characters as well, so don't expect to see Princess Anais, Princess Ada or Saskia either. Another slightly awkward continuation from the second game is Letho, who you could kill for his part in the assassinations or let him live. I'm guessing most people let him live because CD Projekt Red included a large quest for Letho here. It's a good quest as well. A woman asks you to clear a monster out of her house, however when you get there you find it heavily fortified with traps and you find Letho in the attic. He's in hiding from Emir who has hired assassins to kill him. With Geralt's help, Letho fights off a few attempts on his life and tries to fake his own death, although Geralt kinda messes that up for him by rushing in and saving the day when he wasn't supposed to. If you start The Witcher 3 from a save file where you killed Letho, or if you make the choice when being asked about past adventures in Vizima, you just have a bland quest to kill a bunch of wraiths. While the Letho quest is good, I did feel uncomfortable being so chummy with Letho. From my point of view, when Geralt spared his life at the end of Witcher 2, he hadn't forgiven him. He just didn't want any more blood on his hands, and since Letho was no longer a threat, he didn't feel the need to execute a fellow Witcher. While Geralt and Letho travelled together while trying to rescue Yennefer from the Wild Hunt, I never considered them to be particularly close beyond that, and any friendship they did have was ruined when Letho started killing kings. Those assassinations are the reason Nilfgaard was able to invade so easily, which has then led to thousands of deaths. Opting not to kill Letho is one thing, acting like friends reunited is another. The third game attempts to tie up the situation with Alvin and Jack de Aldersberg, although it seems to create a bit of a plot hole in the process. As you may remember from my Witcher 1 video, Alvin was a child that Geralt looked after until he mysteriously disappeared during a battle. He vanished in much the same way that Ciri vanishes when she travels across time and space, so it now seems pretty clear that's what he did too. The prevailing theory, and the one I advocated for in my video, was that Alvin was a child of the Elder Blood like Ciri and had similar powers. When he disappeared, he went back in time and eventually grew up to be the Grand Master Jack de Aldersberg, the main villain of the first game. We know, or strongly suspect, they are the same person thanks to a Dimeritium amulet found on Aldersberg's dead body. A nice touch is that you can revisit the place you found Aldersberg's body, with much nicer graphics of course, when you were in Vizima briefly in Witcher 3. I'd say the third game confirms this theory. While exploring the upper level of what looks like my dream second-hand bookstore, with piles of books scattered all over the place, Geralt found a book entitled My Manifesto, The Life of Jack de Aldersberg. Within that book is a letter addressed to Geralt and signed simply A. The letter tries to warn Geralt of the oncoming White Frost, and mentions the prophecy which states that only a child of the Elder Blood can stop it. This A is one of those children, a chosen one. However, he tried and failed, so the burden now rests with Geralt, or more accurately Ciri. The problem here is that the letter seems to have been written before the events of The Witcher 1, as you would expect given that Alvin had become the Grand Master at this point and knew the White Frost couldn't be stopped, hence his plan to migrate south. And yet it was found inside a book written about Jack de Aldersberg in the past tense, suggesting that the mysterious figure who left the book at the bookshop with the instruction it be given to Geralt did so well after the death of de Aldersberg. I guess the letter could have been written by Alvin and left with someone else who then dropped the book off at a much later date, figuring it would be the best chance of getting it to Geralt. But yeah, while I'm not exactly sure of the events around this, I'm going to go ahead and confirm that Alvin and Aldersberg are the same person, just in case you were in any doubt. Given the scope of not only this game but the previous two, plus the books, some inconsistencies were inevitable. For the most part, CD Projekt Red did a good job onboarding new players, returning players and book fans while not alienating anyone. But it's undeniable that no matter what group you happen to be in, there will be moments that feel a little off, as if you've either missed something important or misremembered something. I said earlier that I consider The Witcher 3's story to be a bit of a letdown compared to the quality of the side stories, but that's not really due to the main story beats as such. The problem is that thing YouTube video essayists love to talk about but rarely properly explain: pacing. Let's look at a very high level overview of the story briefly. As with many stories, it can be split into 3 parts, or acts if you prefer. The first act is looking for Ciri. The second is preparing and engaging in the battle at Kaer Morhen. The third is taking the fight to the Wild Hunt and ultimately emerging victorious. With this in mind, if you were to write a book or movie around this outline, I imagine it would play out as follows. The hunt for Ciri would constitute around the first quarter or maybe 1/3 of the story. Ciri would then explain what happened to her, or we'd get a flashback, and the threat would be established. I would then suggest that the Battle of Kaer Morhen take place at around the halfway point. Geralt and Ciri live to fight another day, but the battle shows just how dangerous the Wild Hunt is, and the death of Vesemir makes for an excellent midpoint, forcing Geralt and Ciri to change tack. They realise they can't keep running and need to take the battle to the Wild Hunt. There would then be some downtime to prepare for the battle, and the final act would be the big fight. CD Projekt Red did admit that it had problems with the length of the game. According to an interview with NoClip, the developers always underestimate their game's runtimes, and they had to cut content from the end. It was going to be even longer. Misjudging game length is an understandable mistake. When you know the content inside out, it's difficult to properly replicate the new player experience. You have no idea how much time people will spend on the side quests and general exploration. Besides, given how weird some people get over runtimes, it's probably better to err on the side of being too long, because this somehow indicates quality to some people. Everyone's playtime and experience is going to vary, so I can only talk in rough numbers, but I've looked at all the quests and their recommended levels, and I'm sure most people will leave the Battle of Kaer Morhen for near the end, leading to a slow first 2/3 at least. If you tackle the main story quests as soon as you hit the required level or a bit before, you could probably structure the experience in a way that you hit the Battle of Kaer Morhen closer to the halfway point. You could then fill out the final act by doing a bunch of side quests until you're ready to complete the game. The problem with this approach is A, you aren't going to know the structure before you play unless you look at a guide, and B, you'll have to delay side quests and contracts well past the point it makes sense to do them, and you'll be way over leveled, especially given how much of the XP comes from the main story quests. And besides, a bunch of these side quests tie into the fight at Kaer Morhen because they dictate who is at the battle. You can't just do them later. So I'd wager most people will take an approach similar to mine, which was to continue with side quests when it was appropriate to do so, e.g. playing the Bloody Barons quests roughly in succession so that they were part of one consistent story, and tackling monster contracts and other side quests when you were roughly the right level. Playing The Witcher 3 this way means you end up spending well over half the story with Ciri missing, and the stakes don't get raised until 3/4 of the way through. There's nothing wrong with the main character's motivation being to look for someone who is missing, especially when there's a close relationship between the protagonist and the missing person. The game even does a decent job making the player care about Ciri thanks to the scene of her training at Kaer Morhen when she was young. The problem is a lack of any obvious danger. That may sound a little silly, but hear me out. The Wild Hunt is a huge threat to this world. People who've read the books will know that already, but people just jumping into the game probably won't. We see the Wild Hunt chase Geralt and Yennefer early on, but Yennefer is able to engineer an escape. We also see the Wild Hunt destroy a small village, and sure, it looks imposing with the ice and all that, but is it any worse than the damage done by the Nilfgaardian armies during the invasion? Replace ice with fire and it's much the same. Hell, even Geralt has left a few small towns looking like this in his time. There's a reason he has the Butcher of Blaviken nickname after all. Plus, Ciri is incredibly powerful. She can jump between realities and time. There's rarely any sense of urgency in the hunt for Ciri because you get the distinct impression she can look after herself. We see evidence of this in her flashbacks. Ciri has limited options in combat, so it isn't much fun to play. However, she can dash around, regenerate health, and generally slice through enemies much more efficiently than Geralt. The stakes change after the Battle of Kaer Morhen. Geralt and Ciri lose a loved one, and we see how incredibly powerful the Wild Hunt can be. As such, I'd argue this moment needed to take place earlier. Mind you, the Wild Hunt are also a little stupid. They would have solved a lot of problems for themselves if one of them had just swung a sword through a frozen Geralt here. Anyway, I would move all the loyalty quests that lead up to this battle and have them take place before the final attack instead. Given that the attack on Kaer Morhen catches people relatively unaware, it doesn't make much sense for Geralt to prepare through what are basically loyalty missions. These quests would fit in better before the final attack, because Geralt and co control the timing on that one. This would shift the Kaer Morhen battle forward to around the midpoint, and help with that all-important pacing. You can tell the ending was chopped and changed a bit. There are multiple moments where you think the game is close to ending. There's language about points of no return and all those other not so subtle clues that you should wrap things up. And yet the game keeps throwing more quests at you, and they aren't always especially good ones. Before climbing Bald Mountain to reach the Crones and Imlerith, you have to grab a coin off the bottom of a pond, which you then present as a token to pass, only to find out you've been tricked and have to fight to the death. I'm not even really sure why we have to fight the Crones at all. I hadn't thought about them for 10 hours at this point. Then there's the whole finding the Sunstone quest that takes a while, and even though the quality of the writing was still high here, I began to find events less engaging. A lot of it definitely feels like it should have been optional, not mandatory. Even the quest names seem deceptive and designed to lure you into thinking you've nearly finished. There's a major quest called Final Preparations, which might make you think you're doing the Final Preparations, only for the quest immediately after that to be called Battle Preparations. Bear in mind there's cut content from this ending as well. At one point Geralt was going to infiltrate the Wild Hunt using his knowledge from when he was part of their crew, and the section where Geralt and Avalak travel between worlds was going to be much longer. I really enjoyed this section even if it did slow things down a bit too much near the end. It was great to travel to completely new worlds, although it would have been nice if they were more visually interesting. I get why they aren't, of course. It would have been a lot of work for a short moment, but it does feel like they visited the most boring parts of the most boring worlds, whereas Ciri managed to see all sorts of cool places on her travels. We need a collaboration between CD Projekt Red and, say, Insomniac, so Geralt can pop up in New York just in time to help Spider-Man with a quest or something. We would also have seen Ciri fighting while skating around on a frozen lake, which is something that happens in the books. Some gameplay ideas had to be cut as well. Weather was going to be much more important, with thunderstorms drastically affecting sailing, for example. Monster spawns were going to change depending on the time of day, and they would also attack each other, which I don't think happens at all in the final game. That would have made the overall world a bit more convincing, but CD Projekt Red has already created something special with this world, so I'm not going to complain about these omissions. I can't imagine how daunting it must have been to go from the relatively confined spaces of the first two games to suddenly being tasked with recreating the entire northern realms. Remember, Sapkowski never created an official map of the region, and many of the major areas are mentioned offhand but not actually visited. Cities like Oxenfurt and Novigrad are mentioned in the books, but most of our time with Geralt and Ciri is spent wandering from place to place. The world of The Witcher 3 feels believable in a way that no other game has managed to date, on both a large scale and a small one. On a large scale, consider the locations of the big cities and small villages and how they are all interconnected. I mentioned earlier that I didn't use fast travel for most of my playthrough, and that's because you typically don't need to. You can get away without any kind of objective markers on the map if you really want to, because every location is linked with at least one well-trodden path, and following these paths is nearly always the quickest way to your destination. Sure, sometimes it might be a bit quicker just to take Roach off-road for the literal shortest route from A to B, but there's always a path to follow if you want to. Before I added the friendly HUD mod, I played around for a bit without using any HUD at all, and I would plan out my journeys beforehand simply by using my map. I'd note which path I should take out of the village when I needed to, say, turn left at a fork, and I'd remember landmarks I could use to help guide my way. This is only possible because CD Projekt Red made sure the world is one that grew naturally, which meant big cities are near the water with lots of points of entry, and then you've got farms further out. Trade needs to flow between regions, so it's only natural for paths to form, and those paths follow natural routes. While riding from place to place, I was struck with the feeling that CD Projekt didn't create a world for its game, it created a game for its world. The world came first, and Geralt's story just happens to take place in it. Now, with all that said, there's a reason I installed a mod which helped guide me to objectives. While going from town to town is easy, finding random spots in the woods isn't, and having an objective marker in those situations is helpful. I also found that due to my terrible memory, I was having to open the map a lot more than I would have liked to remember the route. Really though, while you can navigate with just the map because of how real the world is, the game itself doesn't do enough to cater to players taking this approach. For example, quest givers often give you instructions such as "I'll meet you by the bridge," and yet that information is not recorded in your journal. So unless you complete the quest straight away, you will likely forget where you're supposed to go to hand in the quest. Or the information you're given might be vague, like them telling Geralt, "The monster attacked me in the field," when you're surrounded by fields. Even without extra voice lines, it would be nice if the information was recorded in the journal somewhere, just to avoid looking at quest markers all the time. As it was, I decided to use a mod that gave me the option to bring up a quest marker whenever I activated Witcher senses. It also pulled up info about nearby shops and fast travel points, which could make the screen a little cluttered in busy towns, but I was fine with this. You can customize it to show more or less if you like. A few missions do account for a minimal HUD, such as one where you're given directions to go around a lake and turn right at a large rock before following a path to your destination. If all quests were like this, with those directions getting added to the journal, the HUD-less experience would be a lot better. Turning the HUD off can also lead to problems such as missing objectives, like one that told me to eavesdrop on a conversation to get the details from two women talking about something important. Unfortunately, the quest update doesn't appear on screen if you have the HUD turned off, and there's no other indication that you should listen from a distance instead of running in and interrupting the conversation, which, let's face it, is what we usually do. Some of the mod customization options really should have been included in the base game. For example, you can turn the health bar and combat info on or off. There's no dynamic option. If you turn it off, it won't appear during combat, which makes it tough to keep track of your health, not to mention things like stamina, active oils and potions, etc. The game desperately needs a dynamic option that brings this information up when Geralt is in combat and turns it off when he's not. Fortunately, the mod does have that. I want to give credit to Ubisoft here because while Ubisoft is to blame for the terrible state of minimaps and on-screen HUDs in the last decade, it has started to rectify this somewhat with dynamic options and the exploration modes that make you hunt a little more for the quest objective instead of just following a line. I'm used to these dynamic settings now, and playing The Witcher 3 without them was pretty painful. Still, if you're fortunate enough to be playing on PC with the mod enabled, you can experience one of the best worlds created in a video game with minimal distraction. You can still appreciate the world on console, don't get me wrong, the game just makes you work a little harder for it. Even if you don't want to turn the HUD off permanently, I recommend you give it a try for a while, even if it's just when travelling between large towns. There are lots of points in the main quest line in particular when you will be going to places you know well. Take those opportunities to soak in the view and listen to the fantastic music during your journey. A less noticeable but just as important aspect of world building is Geralt himself, or rather the role he plays in it as a Witcher. All three games have done a decent job showing Witchers as beings that people respect, hate, or both. It's rare to enter a new area and not overhear people talking about Geralt as a monster just as bad as those he hunts. However, if you help the locals out, they do start to change their tune. This is most notable in abandoned villages. If you clear out the monster problem, people will return to the town and be forever grateful. What I love, and I'm surprised to hear myself say this, is the way you are limited in how you can roleplay as Geralt. You probably know that I value the ability to properly roleplay in an RPG. But let's face it, the term RPG is broad, and The Witcher 3 is closer to the likes of Horizon Zero Dawn and Assassin's Creed than it is Planescape Torment. If a game lets you create a character in terms of skill, attitude and backstory, not just appearance, then yeah, I generally expect freedom of choice. However, there's not much scope for that here, and that works strongly in the game's favour. Geralt is a Witcher, and Witchers don't work for free. Despite that, I'd wager many players would opt to turn down rewards for killing monsters on a regular basis because, well, for one thing the rewards are pitiful, but more importantly, that's how we've been trained to think in games. I rarely, if ever, demanded money in games like Baldur's Gate because I was a hero, an adventurer. What kind of adventurer asks for money in exchange for helping people? Likewise in RPGs like Mass Effect, where demanding payment was often associated with renegade choices. A BioWare developer recently revealed that only around 8% of people played the renegade path in Mass Effect. I'd wager that, given the choice, most people would refuse payments on Witcher contracts if that was an option. But it's not. Well, not often anyway. Which means that when it is, that decision really means something. Some of the most powerful moments in the game were completely innocuous conversations that I had with people after solving their problem. Take the guy in Crow's Perch who asks you to kill a shrieker that has been murdering villagers. When you return, trophy in hand, you can accept the payment if you like, but you can also reject it because the man has taken in the now orphaned son of one of the guys the shrieker killed. Geralt takes money from poor people all the time. Like I said, Witchers don't work for free. However, in instances as extreme as this, Geralt can let the payment slide. I found this an incredibly touching moment, but also a great piece of world building because it makes you think about the families of those left behind. The orphaned child isn't just there to give you a lead on where the monster is. He is an individual that needs taking care of, and the game remembers this. Similarly, after finding some orphans who have been cleverly stealing chickens while making it look like wolves did it, you can ask the woman to take the children in, and she reluctantly does. Looking at world building on a local level also shows that a significant amount of effort was put into making each region feel real and genuinely different, and I don't just mean the weather. You can tell Velen is ravaged by war just from all the dead bodies hanging from trees, and the famine is reflected by the lack of animals in the area compared to the rest of the world. The townsfolk are struggling to come to terms with the Nilfgaardian invasion. An innkeeper decides to take down the Temerian symbol over the bar because she knows it could get her in trouble with the Nilfgaardian soldiers. However, some of her customers get angry and threaten to destroy the place. Geralt steps in to save the day, but she's not exactly grateful. She knows her troubles are far from over, and Geralt may have even made things worse. The people of Velen are clearly struggling. A man attempts to burn down the blacksmith's workshop because the blacksmith had been making armour for the Nilfgaardians. I hunted down the arsonist and brought him back to face justice. However, the blacksmith grassed him up to the nearby soldiers who promptly decided to execute him without trial. The blacksmith seems appreciative of the law and order approach that the new rulers are bringing in, but you can practically feel the tension in the air here and know that things are only going to get worse. Up in the north, the free city of Novigrad is a lot less free than it used to be. To prepare for the inevitable war with Nilfgaard, Radovid invaded Kedwin and united the north by defeating all other opposition. Following the meeting at Lot Muin at the end of Witcher 2, Radovid now hates magic users even more than ever, and he works with the Church of the Eternal Fire to hire witch hunters tasked with capturing magic users and burning them at the stake. As the story progresses, Novigrad becomes increasingly extreme, although the exact actions depend slightly on your choices. You might see book burnings in the public square or executions at the entrance. I once saw a mage I bumped into earlier with Triss being burned alive later on in an easily missable moment. I considered saving him, however he was screaming about how it was all my fault, so I left him. Although I never saw him, it's mentioned that Kalkstein from Witcher 1 was one of those burned at the stake. At one point Radovid steps up immigration checks on visitors, so you start to see long lines of people at the entrance waiting to have their goods examined. I opted to help mages like Triss escape the city. However, without an obvious outlet for their anger, the witch hunters started hunting non-humans instead because they simply needed someone to hate. These moments aren't crucial to the main story, and with the exception of the initial executions, the game rarely goes out of its way to point these things out. It doesn't need to. You can feel the atmosphere of Novigrad changing just through NPC dialogue as you wander around. The city of Novigrad is massive, and as such it's divided into districts such as the ports, the bits, which is a poor area, the markets and so on. You start to get a feel for the city and where you are just based on the types of buildings and people around you, and this helps you navigate the city without having to constantly open the map or look at quest markers. I haven't even mentioned Skellige yet, which is probably the best looking region in the game. The sharp mountainous region with snowy ice caps and fishing villages is stunning to explore, and the soundtrack for this region is so good that I never minded taking long windy paths up mountains to get where I needed to go. I might be reading too much into this, but it even feels like the topography of the Skellige Isles contributes to the world building. The people of Skellige are separated by water and mountains, which makes travelling between regions or islands a lot tougher than it is on the mainland. This has contributed to people being split into clans, each with their own customs and practices. It's tempting to think of the people of Skellige, especially those outside the largest regions, as being somewhat backward. However, this isn't really fair. The people of the mainland may be slightly more technologically advanced, however they are quick to succumb to prejudice and to believe what they're told by religious groups, as we see in Novigrad. Beyond all this high level stuff, there are little details that are easily missed or taken for granted. As you watch the footage in this video, pay attention to all the small details that don't have to be there. Any area that has people living in it is equipped with what it needs to support people. There is clutter and mess everywhere, far more than there needs to be. In fishing towns, people are actually out in boats fishing, and in another they aren't because the rain is too severe at the time. When you work with druids to stop the rain, you see the fishermen heading back out in their boats. There are all sorts of small details like women washing clothes in the river, and even things like merchant stalls displaying the goods they actually sell. This inn looks more realistic than any other inn I can remember visiting. While Geralt pays for items in crowns, there are other currencies such as orens and florins that you may find while looting. You can't use these, so you'll need to exchange them for crowns at the bank in Novigrad. As far as I can tell, there was no point to including florins or orens other than to make the world more believable. Nilfgaard has its own currency, so you wouldn't expect to find crowns on the bodies of its soldiers. It's a small touch, but a nice one. The YouTube channel NoClip has a fascinating series of videos on the making of all the Witcher games, and if you watch the one focused on the world of The Witcher 3, you'll hear discussion about how the regions were built up layer by layer. One artist would go in and add some buildings, trees, maybe a stable, and then another would come in and furnish the house before another comes in and adds a bunch of decorations, and then there's another pass where books and loot are added, maybe some more boxes and barrels, that kind of thing. This might well be common practice in developing open worlds, in fact I expect it is, but this struck me as necessary with The Witcher 3. One person couldn't create something so messy and cluttered on purpose. In real life, towns like this are the work of many people. Different tradesmen and families all with different needs and skills living together. After decades, these places grow to best serve the people living there, and that's what happened here. The town didn't grow to be the way it was because it was one person's blueprint. It was a collection of imaginations. If anything, you could maybe argue that the world is a little too busy. CD Projekt Red chose to implement the 30-second rule, meaning there needs to be something for the player to stumble upon every 30 seconds, be it either a point of interest, such as an abandoned tower, or a point of encounter, such as a group of monsters. This desire to stop players getting bored is understandable, but probably not necessary, except for on the water. A couple of times Geralt needs to make some long trips by boat, although not the 25-minute trips that they were in an earlier build of the game, thankfully. and CD Projekt Red included some smuggler's caches along the way to give you something to do. I like how these are implemented, with the gear stashed in chests which are supported and marked by barrels floating on the water. Other ideas were cut in the interests of a better player experience, like having separate inventories for Geralt and Roach. Kingdom Come Deliverance had this system, and I think it worked there because there wasn't so much gear. In The Witcher 3, I imagine such a system would have been a nightmare. It's hard to critique this kind of world building built up via the environment because it's such a soft factor. It's like music for me in that I know it adds a ton to the experience, but I don't always notice it's there, and I certainly don't have the vocabulary to describe what is good and what isn't. That's why I rarely discuss a game's score in my videos, although I should note that it is excellent here. You probably know that already. I can say with confidence that without the unbelievable amount of effort put into creating this world, I wouldn't love The Witcher 3 anywhere near as much as I do. There is one slight problem with the world building which should be addressed, and that's the general whiteness of the entire world of The Witcher as portrayed in the games. It might surprise some of you to know that despite being a liberal SJW cuck, I didn't take any issue with the world being so full of white people back in 2015, and I even rolled my eyes a few times when I saw articles complaining about the situation. That was obviously a terrible attitude to take, and I should have been more open to listening to the people this affects instead of immediately going on the defensive. Hopefully you were ahead of me with all this, but just in case you need to hear the opinion of a privileged white guy to tip you over the edge, here's how I ended up coming around on the topic. First of all, let's look at why CD Projekt Red populated the Witcher world with almost entirely white people in the first place. White people in fantasy stories, and arguably in real life, are treated as the sort of default, white men even more so. When a piece of media stars someone who isn't a straight white cis male, it's like veering away from that default, and for some reason that means the choice becomes open to criticism. A non-straight white cis male protagonist needs to be justified in this medium in particular, although that does seem to be changing. I believe that most artists, when creating a new fantasy story, don't set out to create a piece of media that avoids people of different skin colours. It happens because most publishers of mainstream fantasy are from Europe or North America, and they tend to pick authors from the same places. And the reasoning behind that is a whole other conversation, by the way. And most fantasy takes place in a time before industrialisation and the invention of weapons like guns. This means the starting point for fantasy is usually sword and shield based combat. So the author's mind goes to the place that famously had a lot of sword and shield based combat, and the time period for that. And typically they end up thinking of medieval Europe. More specifically, given that most of these writers are English speakers or influenced by stories originally written in English, the focus tends to end up around the British Isles. George R.R. Martin famously modelled Westeros on the UK and specifically the War of the Roses. The Witcher is based on a Polish set of novels, and you can't escape the European feel to the whole thing. I'm inclined to go even further and say the game version feels quite British. However, that is in part due to the accents used in the localisation, and I'm not sure how that would be represented in the Polish original. It's hard to escape the use of Irish accents on the island situated just to the west of the mainland, or the French ones just to the south. Plus we know Sapkowski was a big fan of the Arthurian legend. Anyway, the point is, when creating this world, CD Projekt Red had medieval Northern Europe in mind. I don't think this was intended to be malicious. I don't think we need to ascribe any ill will to the decision. I just think we need to consider why, as society, we default to whiteness in this way. Believe it or not, in 2015 I had a headcanon justification for thinking it was okay for the world of The Witcher to be so white. Here's how I defended the game in my head when I saw criticism of it I didn't like. In The Witcher, the part of the world we know about is likely quite insignificant and small. There's almost certainly a big wide world out there that we know nothing about. We know that immediately to the south there are Nilfgaardians, but even they are relatively mysterious until they invade the north. If you include people of different skin colour, then you are saying something about the world. First, that it is big enough for people of different colours to have lived and then evolved separately for a substantial period of time. Second, that the world has variances such as climate that result in separate skin colours evolving. And finally, that the world is connected enough for those groups to have now intermingled. My rationale was that this world simply hadn't gotten to that last stage yet. There can be a good reason for people to all be of the same skin colour in a game, and I don't see it as my place to force every game to be multicultural, and I still don't. But I have changed my mind about The Witcher 3. You see, any artist or group of artists has the right to create a game world where everyone is the same skin colour. That includes white people. For example, if someone wants to create a game set in England in the year 850, then I don't take any issue with basically everyone being white. There's nothing wrong with wanting to create a world in a game that looks as close to the one you're representing as possible. This is why I didn't have a huge problem with Kingdom Come Deliverance being so white. When people were raging against that game, they liked to point out that there were traders from Asia and Africa in what is now the Czech Republic back in the early 15th century. And that's likely true, but they were incredibly rare. Hell, there aren't exactly a lot of non-white people in the Czech Republic now once you're outside of the major cities, something that seems to have been lost on the writers of said articles, who likely live in diverse cities and don't realise that not every part of the world is so diverse. To be fair, it didn't help that one of the lead developers at Warhorse Studios is a horrible racist, but that doesn't excuse making stuff up to fit a convenient story. Those examples deal with recreations of the real world though. The problem comes once you start veering from that realistic portrayal. If you have a fantasy world, one with magic and portals that allow people to travel from place to place instantly, then you're starting to get on pretty iffy ground when everyone is the same skin colour and there's little cultural diversity. The world of The Witcher is white, but it doesn't need to be. The beings of this world didn't even originate here. They came from other worlds initially, and elves still live in multiple realms. There's simply no need for everyone to be white, and without a reason for such homogeneity, the decision becomes open to criticism, and that criticism is valid. Besides, the world of The Witcher is clearly more interesting with people of different colours and cultures, as is our own. We can see that from the TV show. Homogeny is boring, and we need to move away from white being a default in fantasy stories, and arguably many others. Now, assuming everyone's done from raging in the comments, let's get back to some positive stuff and talk about the strongest part of the game, the side quests. While finding Ciri is important, the way the quests are structured means there is rarely any sense of urgency, even if you're playing like me and ignoring a lot of the side content like Gwent and racing. At the start, Geralt is given 3 vague pieces of information on Ciri's whereabouts, which instructs him to head to Velen, Novigrad and Skellige. It's very clear you should start in Velen, then move to Novigrad and finally Skellige, although you can break the order if you really want. I wouldn't recommend it, especially on the higher difficulty settings, but there is a degree of freedom there. However, what this means is that for over half the game you have a generic Find Ciri quest in your log that specifically tells you won't be able to find her just yet because you haven't completed tasks in other areas. When you're listening to the Bloody Baron describe his meeting with Ciri, there's a part of you that knows you're nowhere close to finding her or even getting a solid lead on her because you still have to do the Novigrad and Skellige parts of the quest. It was always unlikely Geralt would find her early on, but ideally a story should have a sense of surprise, or at least the potential for a surprise. Instead, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there will be no major story-changing revelation in Novigrad because you still have the Skellige lead to follow up on. In my playthrough, it wasn't until the roughly 70-hour mark that I finally found Ciri. I spent most of that time doing side quests, and I imagine most people were the same. While this partly speaks to the inadequacy of the main story, it also speaks to the quality of the side quests that I was never bored, partly because the side quests don't feel like side quests at all. Neither do most of the monster contracts, and even the treasure hunts have a lot more effort put into them than I'd expect for something that is under the 4th drop-down heading in the journal. Saying these side quests feel like main quests could sound like a bit of a backhanded compliment. For all that I'm trying to praise the side quests, I'm also knocking the main quests a bit. Main quests have a tendency to feel like distractions from the main event, and side quests will branch off of main quests in such a way you don't notice the distinction unless you check your journal. This makes these side quests incredibly engaging and yet does show up the lack of focus in that main quest line. Let's look at an example from the Novigrad section of the Ciri hunt, which illustrates just how the main quests can meander from the beaten path so much you'd be forgiven for forgetting you're doing a main quest. When you show up in Novigrad, you're told to look for Triss. However, she's not at her house because magic users are being hunted in the city. Following a lead, you find Triss, who tells you to speak to a dreamer who might be able to help Geralt track Ciri due to his strong connection to her. Unfortunately, the dreamer slipped into unconsciousness while trying to help a merchant with a house he just bought that seems to be haunted. Geralt deals with the problem and talks to the dreamer, which gives him an incredibly brief vision of Dandelion. He then hunts down Dandelion, however Dandelion is nowhere to be seen, having gotten himself into trouble while executing a heist. This involves a lot of running around after ex-girlfriends of Dandelion's and crime lords until Geralt discovers that Dandelion is being held by a man called Menga. Along with Zoltan, Geralt comes up with a plan to free Dandelion, which is to use a Doppler, basically a shapeshifter, to pretend to be Menga and give the order to transfer Dandelion, and then Geralt can attack the transport to free Dandelion. Still with me? Because this is my favourite bit. Remember, this is all still the main quest. The Doppler we need is in hiding because Dopplers are hated by regular people. It's an understandable fear. Dopplers can not only assume the appearance of anyone else, they can also take all their memories, and can therefore create effectively perfect copies. That's a huge superhero power. If you knew there were Dopplers roaming your town, you would not be able to trust anyone in any encounter. Geralt needs to coax the Doppler Dudu out of hiding, so to do this he decides to put on a play because Dudu is a fan of the arts. You sort out the play, deciding on the title, theme and even the lead actors, and then arrange for guards to keep the crowd under control and for a group of musicians to promote it. To get the guards you have to win a fist fight, and to get the musicians to play you have to deal with a group that's been harassing them. Let's take a step back and look at it from the other direction. At one point I was dealing with a group of racists so that a band could perform to promote a musical that I put on with the goal of luring a Doppler out of hiding so that the Doppler could impersonate a crime lord and give instructions for Dandelion to be moved so that I could attack the transport and free him. And I'm doing all this because of a second long glimpse of Dandelion during a vision, which leads me to believe he might know something about where Ciri is. It's not that Geralt wouldn't go to extreme lengths to save Ciri, clearly he would, it's just so easy to forget he's doing it for Ciri because you have to remember so many layers. He's helping musicians who will in turn help the theatre director put on the play, which will lure the Doppler out of hiding, who will help find Dandelion, who might be able to help with Ciri. We're always helping someone else in exchange for help from someone else who can help with something else which will please someone else, who it turns out can't actually help us all that much. So once all this is done and we are finally reunited with Dandelion, we get his story where he puts on a heist with Ciri and then she vanishes during a chase and he doesn't really know where she went. The thing is, I don't dislike this part of the story at all, and I enjoyed every minute of putting on the play and finding Dandelion. Actually, seeing Geralt on stage is close to a highlight of the game.
Stand guard, beware, kill the beast if he shows. Your reward you'll receive on my finest pillows.
I kill monsters for pleasure, and no man is my measure.
The writing is strong, so this is all fun. It just doesn't help with any sense of urgency relating to the main plot, and you'd be forgiven for thinking the whole thing was just a side quest. Fortunately though, that is a good thing in a way because the side quests are bloody brilliant. I have tried to limit the number of quests I talk about here because I don't want this entire video to just be story commentary. However, there are so many that I want to talk about because I love them or was moved by them in some way. There are easily 10 side quests that, if included in another game, would be talked about and praised as must-see experiences. The obvious one is the Bloody Baron questline, which is often referenced as an example of an epic side quest, although doing so is cheating a bit because a large part of the story is mandatory. It's only the conclusion that is a side quest. A lot of these side quests are like this, and it's a largely pointless distinction to make because ultimately they don't feel like quests or a collection of separate quests, some mandatory, some optional. Rather, it's like playing through a story. Once I started a particular storyline, I would see that storyline through to the end, even if one quest ended and the next quest in that story was a side quest or even had too high of a recommended level. Even the second time around, the Bloody Baron storyline is absolutely phenomenal. During the latest war between the North and Nilfgaard, the Bloody Baron ended up commanding a ragtag group of soldiers that hunkered down at Crow's Perch. The local Nilfgaardian commander decided it would be easier to control Veland through the Baron than to fight him, and so gave him official command of the area. The Baron took Ciri in and has information on where she's gone. However, he won't tell Geralt much about her until Geralt helps him find his missing wife and daughter. We do know that the Baron took in Ciri and the child called Gretka, who found Ciri. He let Gretka stay as well because she had nowhere else to go. It's later revealed that Gretka's father tricked her by telling her to follow a trail of treats away from their house so she would end up with the witches of Crookback Bog and not return. He was annoyed at her for breaking a jug and decided she was an extra mouth that they couldn't afford to feed. Even minor side characters have tough backstories in this world. At this stage, the Bloody Baron feels like a fairly sympathetic character, albeit not an especially nice one. However, as Geralt unravels the mystery of the Baron's wife and daughter's disappearance, it becomes clear the Bloody Baron is not deserving of your sympathy. He drinks too much and beats his wife. One day in a drunken rage he beat her so hard she miscarried, leading to the wife and daughter running away. His attempts to excuse his actions only makes him seem more wretched. He claims that his wife knows how to push his buttons and get him mad, and then talks about her affair with another man that lasted 3 years. I had a tiny bit of sympathy for him here until he then boasted about brutally murdering the man in question as a response. The one part of the Baron that does feel genuine is his love for his daughter. There's a sweet moment where he shows Geralt a doll of Triss Merigold that he made for his daughter when she was young, and given that Geralt is also looking for his adoptive daughter, it is easy to relate to him about this part at least. After the wife and daughter fled, the Baron buried the stillborn child, which Geralt deduced had now turned into a botchling and needed to be dealt with. The easiest way to do so involved giving the child a name and a proper burial, at which point the spirit of the child proceeds to lead Geralt to the home of the people who helped the wife and daughter flee, which was awfully kind of it, and the logic here is probably best not thought about too much. Geralt now knows where the Baron's wife and daughter are, and he demands the rest of the story about Ciri, which the Baron reluctantly hands over. Through a flashback, we see the Baron take Ciri in, look after her, and even go on a horse race with her that ends in them taking on a basilisk. With the Baron facing certain death from the fight, Ciri uses her magic to teleport up to the top of the tower and save its life. However, using her magic in this way means the Wild Hunt will be able to track her, so she has to leave. This is where the mandatory part of the Bloody Baron quest ends, but even though the Baron doesn't deserve any more of your time, you can choose to help him rescue his wife if you like, after it's discovered she's with the witches of the Crookback Bog. The exact resolution to this story depends on decisions you've already made, but for me the Baron's wife died even though we were able to free her from the curse. The Baron's daughter turned up too, and she never forgave the Baron for his role in things. When I returned to Crow's Perch to collect my reward, I found the Baron hanging lifeless from a tree. It's definitely one of the more striking moments I remember seeing in a game, and once again it had me sympathising with him a bit despite what he had done. The Bloody Baron does a great job setting the stage for what is to come. Repeating themes that you'll see throughout this video are characters and settings that cross multiple different quest lines and stories and contain tragic endings no matter what Geralt does. These side quests are possibly the truest representations of the books in the games. While the main quest line follows the Elder Blood story directly from the books, the first couple of books were actually effectively short story collections with recurring characters, and these side quests or mini stories or whatever the hell you want to call them capture that essence perfectly. As an example of how characters cross stories, let's look at the Witches of Crookback Bog. While they mainly serve as the evil witches that imprisoned the Baron's wife in this story, they have a lot more to them, literally. The villagers of nearby Downwarren worship the witches and offer sacrifices in the form of their ears when they need the witches' help. That's why the trail that leads you to the witches is a trail of ears. While it's hard to ascertain the full extent of what the witches do for Downwarren, it does appear that they genuinely help. The villagers credit the witches with keeping the plague away from the town, for example, and indirectly they are now helping with the deadly spirit that has been murdering townsfolk for 3 years by sending Geralt in to deal with the problem. The spirit is a thing in a tree which has been possessing animals and using them to kill people. The spirit claims the witches trapped it here in the first place, and rumours in town hint that the spirit is either the mother of the witches or their creator. Geralt can either kill the spirit or free it. While the option to free it involved the use of blood magic, not something usually associated with a good cause, I decided to do just that, and as a result the spirit rescued a bunch of orphan children that the witches were holding captive along with the Baron's wife. However, it also killed everyone in the village of Downwarren, seemingly as a punishment for their worship of the witches. Best get used to stories that end badly no matter what you do. One of my favourite stories is the one that starts with a seemingly innocent visit to the local herbalist, who turns out to be none other than Kira Metz, a former member of the Lodge of Sorceresses who Geralt is already well acquainted with. Kira got a brief mention in Witcher 2, but this is the first time we've seen her in the games. She's now hiding from King Radovid, who has a bone to pick with the Lodge after the events of the second game. Kira helps you in the hunt for Ciri by telling you about a run-in she had with a mysterious masked mage, and then leading you to an elven temple to follow his trail. If you choose to work with her after this, she has you investigate a strange tower on the Isle of Folker, which was once home to a powerful mage. The tower is haunted, not to mention full of mice. However, thanks to the lantern she gave Geralt, he can listen and watch ghostly conversations from the past. When Geralt reaches the top, he meets the ghost of Annabelle, who reveals her tragic tale. Annabelle and her family were rich nobles hiding out in the tower to avoid the Nilfgaard attack. Annabelle fell in love with a local fisherman called Graham, but her father disapproved of the relationship. The villagers attacked the family in the tower because they thought the family were trying to escape the famine ravishing the area and believed they were hoarding food. There was also a mage residing with the family working on a cure for the plague in his lab. The mage gave Annabelle a potion that would make it look like she was dead so the villagers would leave her alone. However, the villagers killed everyone else, and the potion worked so well that even Graham, who had come along hoping to stop the attack, assumed she was dead too. With no one to wake her, Annabelle was left in a paralysed state, unable to move but still conscious, while the rats slowly ate her alive. Annabelle dies with a strong hatred for Graham, believing that her lover had been part of the attack and that he let her die. This hatred creates a curse, and the only way to break it is to have her forgive Graham. Geralt can either take Annabelle's remains to Graham on the mainland or bring Graham to her. This quest neatly illustrates another core part of the world, which is that there is often no good choice to make. There's certainly no clear and obvious paragon or renegade option, or whatever you want to call it, but even if you do pick the best option, it still typically ends in suffering. You really are choosing between a lesser of two evils. The worst choice is to take the remains off the island, because it turns out that Annabelle's spirit is actually a plague maiden, and taking her off the island frees her from the tower. Geralt should pick up that not all is as it seems though. There are a few inconsistencies in Annabelle's story that he comments on, so it's clear she's not to be trusted. Graham will come willingly if you ask him. He's distraught to find out that his lover was alive the entire time and that he abandoned her, and is determined to let her spirit rest. You still discover that Annabelle is a plague maiden, but this time you can kill her and she never leaves the tower. However, Graham dies in the process. While the Witcher games slowly moved away from the Polish folklore vibe over the course of the 3 entries, this is one of these stories that strongly harkens back to the spirit of the original game, especially the Lakeside chapter. I was left with that strong suspicion I just witnessed an adaptation of a fairy tale, even though I had no idea what fairy tale had been adapted. Part of that might have been to do with Kira Metz pulling a Cinderella part of the way through though. My only slight criticism is the lack of choice with this resolution. I appreciated having 2 bad endings, however Geralt clearly knows Annabelle is up to something, and yet you only get a couple of opportunities to press her on this, and ultimately you have to either fall for her trick or bring Graham to her, which results in his death. I wish we could somehow have called out her lies, perhaps by finding journals in the area with more information that allowed Geralt to piece together what had happened. Another major story that is technically optional, despite consisting of several long quests, is the Choose the King mission on Skellige. Geralt first arrives on Skellige during the funeral of King Bran. Bran is given a Viking-style send-off, with his body placed on a boat that is sent out to sea and set alight by an arrow. Tradition dictates that the king's wife should burn alongside him, despite the technicality of her still being alive. Bran had a wife and a mistress, and it was the mistress, the one who spent less time with him, who eagerly volunteers to take her place on the boat. People mourn the loss of such a young life, although there wasn't exactly a huge clamour to stop her, and there's some resentment towards the older widow Berna for not sacrificing herself instead. Skellige doesn't have a hereditary monarchy, so the next ruler is to be chosen by a clan vote. At the wake, a bunch of contenders throw their weapons down to enter the race, including, controversially, a woman, Ceres. There's no rule against having a female leader, however there has never been one before, and a lot of loud angry men are accusing her of burning private correspondence in the fire before it could be used as evidence. The candidates for ruler need a show of strength and power on their resumes, and in seeking to do so, Crack-on-Crate's children Ceres and Hjalmar get themselves in trouble, and Crack asks Geralt to help. They feel like standard side quests at this point, although they are good ones. The way the two of them go about achieving glory says much of their characters. Hjalmar essentially attempts a giant slaying, so Geralt works with him to take down the beast. It's a typical act of heroism, the sort of thing bards like Dandelion would sing stories about, but it's not necessarily the act of someone who should be the ruler of a large realm. Ceres sets herself a task that on the face of it seems mild by comparison. She's going to free Udalric from a curse which makes him hurt himself, with Udalric going as far as to pluck out his own eye at one point. Ceres initially believes that the curse is the result of Udalric's role in his brother's death, and that to end the curse, Udalric must return a ceremonial sword to his brother Archie's resting place. They get the sword and place it with Archie's body on the seabed, however that doesn't dispel the curse. Geralt then figures out what's wrong. Udalric feels severe guilt over his brother's death, and that guilt caused a Heim to latch on to Udalric. Heims attack people with intense feelings of guilt, and it certainly sounds like Udalric has reason to feel guilty. After Udalric's father broke with tradition and named the younger son Archie as his heir, the two brothers went out on a boat and Archie drowned. The exact circumstances aren't entirely clear. It doesn't appear that Udalric murdered his brother, but his guilt suggests he could have done more to save him. Geralt can opt to fight the Heim outright, however another option is to trick the Heim into entering another person who is feeling even more guilt than Udalric, and then absolving that person of guilt, leaving the Heim with no one to feast off. The problem is making someone feel a more intense guilt than letting their brother die, and then somehow absolving them of that guilt. Ceres comes up with a plan. She tells Geralt to get a fire started and then disappears before coming back later having kidnapped Udalric's baby. She hands the baby to Geralt and demands he place the baby in the fire. If you do this, Geralt feels such a powerful guilt that the Heim leaves Udalric and is about to enter Geralt when Ceres reveals that the baby is alive and well, freeing Geralt of that guilt and leaving the Heim with nowhere to go. Overall, I think it's an excellent quest, although the resolution didn't quite sit right with me. Ceres told Geralt she had a plan, so when she handed Geralt the baby, I decided to have Geralt do as she instructed, knowing that this was part of the plan. The problem with that, of course, is that if you know it's part of a plan, you know the baby will be okay because the plan was to make someone, in this case Geralt, feel guilty and then absolve them of that guilt. So he wouldn't feel guilty in the first place and therefore it wouldn't work. A better approach might have been to trick Geralt into a fight and make it look like he accidentally killed the baby in the process. Anyway, this is just one small part of choosing the monarch because all Geralt has done so far is help out Crack's children. He has no intention of getting involved in the vote, which is up to the clans. However, he's left with little choice when a mysterious bear attack interrupts a meal hosted by Crack and leaves nearly every candidate dead except for Ceres and Hjalmar, Crack's two children, and Svanrigger, the son of Bran, the dead king, who wasn't at the feast. Given that Crack also hosted the event as well as now representing 2/3 of the surviving candidates, suspicion naturally falls on his family, and he asks for your help to solve the problem. Geralt's investigation reveals that the bears were in fact berserkers, cursed people who turn into bears, kind of like werewolves. If you were paying attention during the fight, you'd already know they weren't real bears because Geralt used his silver sword against them. While in the previous 2 games I had the controls set up such that I had to choose which sword Geralt used, for this one I opted to have it happen automatically. With the extra dodge button I couldn't quite map the buttons out as I would have liked, and this one seemed an easy sacrifice. During this fight Geralt automatically pulled out his silver sword, so he seemingly already knew they weren't normal bears. Geralt can then help solve this mystery, either by working with Hjalmar or Ceres. Ceres wants to find out who was responsible by tracking down who spiked the drinks used to initiate the conversion at the feast, and Hjalmar wants to go beat some people up. Either way, the mystery does get solved. My Geralt sided with Ceres, which was an obvious option given that her approach was close to what Geralt would usually do anyway. It definitely had nothing to do with her being an attractive redhead with a sexy Irish accent. Geralt's decision here is a lot more significant than it first appears, because whoever solves the mystery ends up being crowned ruler. The actual guilty party is Brenna, the widow of King Bran, who wants her son to take the throne. Even though Geralt and Ceres, or Geralt and Hjalmar as the case may be, gather evidence against Brenna in the form of a testimony from the guy responsible for spiking the drinks and a letter from her instructing him to do so, this isn't enough for a conviction. The letter wasn't signed and one man's word isn't enough. That's when her son, Svanrigger, bravely steps in. He asks Brenna why she instructed him not to attend the feast when he had planned to. He realises she did so to keep him safe during the bear attack, and her son's statement is enough to convict her, which on Skellige means she gets tied to a rock and left to die. This story is excellent, and it's hard to believe it's optional given how long it is, not to mention how Geralt decides the fate of the entire Skellige Isles going forward. He does much the same thing in Temeria. During the quest for Ciri, you meet Dijkstra, a character fairly prominent in the books but only mentioned in passing during the previous games. He's an excellent character. Excellent as in he's an arsehole but an entertaining arsehole, and he has a rich history. Characters like Dijkstra are another reason this world feels so alive. They aren't NPCs for you to talk to every now and again. They have their own lives and stories, and they continue to act even when you aren't around. Dijkstra used to be head of the Redanian intelligence service, and he played an important role in both of the previous 2 wars with Nilfgaard. He was incredibly effective as a spy and worked his way up to advisor to a king despite his commoner background. However, as is so often the case, spies can know too much, and eventually his own master decided to get rid of him. Dijkstra was tipped off and went into hiding, where he once again worked his way to the top, this time as head of a criminal gang in Novigrad. He's a brilliant spy. There's a great quote about Dijkstra in the books, open quote, "A popular saying at King Vizimir's court held that if Dijkstra states it is noon yet darkness reigns all around, it is time to start worrying about the fate of the sun." Close quote. Like Roach, Dijkstra has no faith in King Radovid and believes he's basically lost the plot. Roach and Dijkstra team up with Thala, who you may remember as a spy from Witcher 1. Unfortunately, the game has no way to take into account actions you took in the first game that may have resulted in Thala dying. Roach, Dijkstra and Thala devise a scheme to kill Radovid, but they need Geralt's help to lure him off his boat where he is unreachable. To be honest, he looks perfectly murderable sat on a chair out in the open, but whatever. Radovid asks Geralt to hunt down the sorceress Philippa, who you may remember is now blind following her torture at the hands of Radovid in Witcher 2. Plan is for Geralt to pretend he's found Philippa and lure Radovid off the boat to capture her. Again, this feels a little silly. Given how paranoid Radovid is, I can't imagine he would leave the safety of the boat so easily, but we have to roll with it. Geralt isn't really lying because he does know where Philippa is. She's been in Novigrad in plain sight all along, disguised as Zoltan's pet owl. Given that the owl is also blind, it's quite likely you'll pick up on this when you first meet it. Philippa insists that she gets to be the one to kill Radovid, and in the end, she gets her wish. While Geralt and Witchers in general aren't supposed to get involved in politics, it's not hard to make an exception for Radovid. And yes, I know that kind of makes me a hypocrite because I did complain about Letho killing kings before, but I like to think the circumstances are different. Never let it be said that I commit regicide without good reason. Radovid is ultimately responsible for all the executions of magic users and their non-humans, and I'll never forget how he casually stood there and ordered his men to pluck out Philippa's eyes in Witcher 2. If you were feeling a little conflicted about the entire thing, that will likely go away when Radovid orders his soldiers to kill Geralt once Geralt has led him to Philippa's supposed location. He's a nasty piece of work, even more so than he was in previous games. This isn't so much a character inconsistency as it is a monarch's slow descent into madness, and it's one of the stronger character arcs that covers all three games. Killing Radovid doesn't solve all Temeria's problems, not by a long shot. The plan was for Dijkstra, Roach and Thala to negotiate with Nilfgaard for a surrender of Temeria, but they were under no illusions about what this would involve. Nilfgaard would take over Temeria and only allow it to be run as a vassal state, with a moderate amount of independence. It's not a win as such, but they see it as being better than being ruled by Radovid with the prospect of more war once Nilfgaard invades the north. This storyline is another great one, right up until the end when there is an epilogue that spoils much of what came before, especially Dijkstra's character. Remember, Dijkstra's prevailing characteristic is his intelligence. More than once he's worked his way up from the bottom based on his intelligence alone. He isn't a good fighter and he doesn't come from a noble family. He's clever and ruthless along with it, and that combination has so far served him well. So what does Dijkstra do once Radovid is dead? Well, he decides he actually wants the war to continue, with himself in a position of power, and to do that he will kill Roach, Vess and Thala. Not only that, he announces this in front of Geralt and expects Geralt to step aside. Geralt and Roach were friends in my playthrough, and likely most people's playthroughs. Geralt has a hell of a lot more loyalty to Roach, Vess and Thala than he does to Dijkstra, who has made it clear on more than one occasion that he wouldn't hesitate to kill Geralt. There isn't much of a decision to make here. Sure, Witchers try not to get involved, but at this point Geralt has already helped kill a king. In for a penny, in for a pound. Even when Geralt joins forces with Roach, Vess and Thala, Dijkstra still decides to go ahead and attack with a few men, and he is of course killed. This annoyed me a lot. Dijkstra is clever, that's his whole stick. He's been successful in life because he's made the right moves at the right time. He's been an excellent judge of character. This is the wrong move at the wrong time and shows terrible judge of character. If he really did want to go ahead with his plan to screw over others, and I don't think it was a good idea anyway, he could have done it in a way that wouldn't link back to him, or couldn't be proven at least, like arranging for Roach and Vess to have an accident on the road or get attacked by bandits. And he certainly wouldn't do it while Geralt was there, just wait for him to leave. So yeah, this part spoiled an otherwise excellent story. It was one final twist that wasn't necessary. Fortunately, there are plenty more incredible stories, some of which have surprise twists that subvert expectations in a way that improves what came before, not the opposite. A seemingly innocuous quest hit me hard when it ended. While in Novigrad, Geralt is asked to help a man die for a special black pearl on Skellige to get as a present for his wife. I didn't go to Skellige for quite some time after this, and even once there I did plenty of other quests before helping this man get a pearl for his wife. I met up with him on the shore and, predictably, he couldn't swim down to get it himself, and Geralt ends up doing it for him, plus he rescues the man from a drowner attack. The man then pulls the old "I forgot my wallet" excuse and tells you to meet him back in Novigrad for payment. While you can skip back to Novigrad quickly enough if you want, this was back when I was not using fast travel except when mandatory, and I was determined not to just nip back to Novigrad before the story took me there. Besides, I had a feeling I wouldn't get the money and was expecting to be attacked by a group of bandits when I got there, or maybe find that the guy's wife had left him while he was away perhaps. Something about this quest had always felt a little off, and how do you forget to bring money with you when you go into another country? Eventually Geralt returned to Novigrad and went to collect his coin, expecting either an attack or another set of excuses for not paying. There was no attack and the man paid what he owed, but boy did his story hit me hard. This was such a small and insignificant side quest. All Geralt did was dive into the water and kill a couple of drowners. I wasn't expecting the guy to tell me a story of how his wife was suffering from dementia and how he hoped giving her the black pearl he'd always promised her would bring her memory back. It didn't work. Now admittedly I do have a history of dementia and Alzheimer's in the family, so this likely hit me harder than it would others, but I'm sure this was not only excellent writing but perfect quest structure too. At no point do you suspect such an ending. In fact, there's even another, far more mundane quest about diving for a pearl on Skellige. You're not supposed to think anything of it or expect such a sad story, and that's then why it works. It's not just the side quests that pull tricks like this either. The monster contracts usually follow the structure of speak to villager who tells you about monster, go to spot where monster killed people, follow trail, kill monster, return to villager for a reward. However, while the structure may be simple, that doesn't mean the story around it can't be either moving or surprising. One quest sees Geralt turn up at a village full of pigs with only one human survivor, Yontek, and he's a bit on the simple side. You discover that the villagers were turned into pigs because they tried to steal some cursed treasure, and only Yontek didn't get involved. Together you herd the pigs back to the treasure and turn them back into humans. But despite Geralt's best efforts, the villagers still don't appreciate Yontek, and Geralt has no choice but to recommend he find another village to live in. This was particularly moving because Geralt is given the option to stick up for Yontek, so you assume his efforts will result in a happy ending for Yontek. But as we know, you can never assume there will be a good resolution to a quest. The most surprising contract has to be the Phantom of Eldberg. At its core it is a decent monster contract. Geralt is asked to investigate a missing lighthouse keeper, and when he gets there he finds the man hiding from a penitent, or a type of wraith. If Geralt investigates, he discovers that the penitent is the result of a curse cast on the lighthouse keeper because he has been letting ships hit the rocks and sink in exchange for money from the recovered cargo. Geralt confronts the lighthouse keeper, and in my case he decided to let him keep his job because he seemed so terrified of Geralt that I couldn't imagine him doing it again, whereas you can't necessarily say the same about a new lighthouse keeper. This is already a decent quest, but there's a lot more to it. When Geralt heads back to the innkeeper who gave him the contract in the first place, he ends up getting in a fight with some idiots and the innkeeper is killed. I liked this innkeeper. He was a reasonable man and only died because he stuck up for Geralt against two morons who hate people from the continent. And that's still not all. Geralt is arrested for his part in the scuffle and is brought before Madman Lugos. Geralt can't afford to pay the blood price for the two idiots he killed, so he ends up offering to pay the debt by helping Madman Lugos' son and a few friends complete another quest called Cave of Dreams. This quest sees the group effectively confronting their worst fears, with Geralt's being the Wild Hunt. With the quest complete, Geralt can pay off his debt and go on his way. I find it incredible that such a lengthy storyline is so easy to miss. You can initiate the Cave of Dreams quest separately by stumbling upon Madman Lugos randomly, however that is kind of unlikely. Instead, this sort of secondary quest comes from what could be any other monster contract, and quite a late one at that, and as such I expect a fair few people missed it. Even the quests that are essentially treasure hunts for special pieces of Witcher gear contain quite a bit of story, although this time it is relegated to journal entries and the like. The Cat School gear quest has Geralt following the trail of a dead Witcher called Kian, and you end up fighting his ghostly form at the end. It just goes to show though that CD Projekt Red is almost incapable of throwing out just a casual fetch quest without some elegant writing to back it up. Believe it or not, I am self-aware enough to know that I've talked for way too long about side quests already, and yet I'm far from done. When reviewing my footage I tried to make a select list of side quests to discuss, and after realising this list was way too long, I tried to triage it a bit to focus on the main ones and skim over the others, but even this was way too much. However, it's no exaggeration to say that my time spent doing side quests was my favourite part of The Witcher 3, and given that it's probably my favourite game of all time, I can't really not talk about them. I am going to move quickly though. Wild at Heart is a short and simple quest that is one of my favourites. It's another one of those where you feel like you're in the middle of a dark fairy tale while playing it. Geralt is asked to locate a missing wife. After asking around town, it turns out she was last seen going into the woods, with one child specifically mentioning that her sister had been with her. Geralt makes his way to the scene of the crime and bumps into the sister, who begs him to call off the investigation. She'll pay Geralt the full amount of money just to go away and say the sister's body will never be found. Of course, Geralt isn't about to accept that slightly suspicious offer. The beast that killed the missing wife turned out to be a werewolf, who in turn was the husband who sent you on the quest in the first place. The thing is, the husband has no idea he killed his wife. He can't remember and he's obviously distraught when you tell him. But there's more to it. The sister was in love with her brother-in-law and she deliberately led her sister out to the woods knowing that the werewolf would kill her. In my playthrough I killed the werewolf and let the sister live, although you can opt to kill the sister for her crime. There's no good ending for the In the Heart of the Woods quest either. Geralt is tasked with dealing with a monster in the woods and the locals propose a couple of solutions. The religious leaders believe the monster will go away with a few offerings, while a group of younger townsfolk don't believe the religious nonsense and want you to kill it. The religious option sounds like a load of baloney and a temporary fix at best, so Geralt killed the monster. However, on returning to town, Geralt finds the religious leaders dead at the hands of the younger folk who have instigated a revolution of sorts. But even taking the other route doesn't lead to a better outcome. The religious leaders still get attacked. Geralt can defend them, but either way there will be a huge loss of life. As the journal entry for this quest notes, more people end up dying by the sword on this day than were ever killed by the monster. Outside of the crew at Kaer Morhen, our experiences with other witches in the games are more often than not negative. What with Berengar in the first game and Letho in the second, and the bad run continues here when we visit a town where all the locals have been brutally murdered except for a young girl. The culprit turns out to be another witcher, who manages to trick Geralt into taking poison before they battle. There's a nice little nod to the books in this quest when the lethality of a commoner with a pitchfork is mentioned. One short quest is not so much a nod to the books as it is just straight up copying. Just outside Oxenfurt, Geralt can stumble upon a man trying to sell a basilisk, except it's not a basilisk, it's a wyvern, and Geralt calls him out on it. In the books, this story happens to Ciri. I did wonder whether this is supposed to be the same man pulling the same trick. However, in the books I think he lost an arm and that doesn't seem to be the case here. I guess CD Projekt Red just liked this story and wanted to include it. There are moments of lightheartedness amongst all the grim tales, such as the case of the Oxenfurt drunk, which sees Geralt get drunk and wander the streets singing to bait out a vampire that only feeds on drunk people.
Our third maid was not and gave it up to any man standing her lion.
And another drunk incident at Kaer Morhen when the witchers decide to use Yen's FaceTime account to invite some ladies over.
Now, I'll do the talking. You two fiddle with the crystals. Kedmil blood et wa hocus pocus abracadabra splather.
What is this? Who's that?
So sorry. We were never here.
Guards! More paper, Excellency! No, you oaf! The lodge has come for me!
I trust you have an explanation for this. A very good one.
My favourite joke quest is probably the Tower Out of Nowhere, which sees Geralt help a wizard break through an annoying barrier called Defensive Regulatory Magitron, which you may notice has the initials DRM. The solution for DRM is Gottfried's Omni-Opening Grimoire, or GOG. This one probably doesn't have the same impact if you're playing on console. The books tend to go for a dry humour, and while the games attempt this a bit with Geralt, most of the jokes are slightly more slapstick in nature, such as when Geralt asks for a door out of the tower and is portaled into the water instead.
And should you ever visit Kovir, do stop by Pomvanis. Aboragi, Baratheon.
Wait, what are you doing?
Not this way, the door.
Or quests like the Vow of Silence, where Geralt agrees to help a man who has supposedly lost his voice. A friend tells you that the man may regain his voice if you surprise him, so Geralt messes around making a load of noise until the guy explodes and rages at you for forcing him to break his vow of silence. Geralt gets to play teacher at one point, which goes about as well as you'd expect.
So, who would like to ask the first question?
Me! What's it mean that witches are lecturers?
You shouldn't listen to everything people say about.
Means they go to sleep early. Oh! So that's why Mum went to tuck that witcher in.
He also needs to herd a goat called Princess, who even has her own health bar, although she can't actually die. These light-hearted quests are nice, but make no mistake, the majority of the quests are depressing and don't end happily. For example, Geralt is sent after a monster who's been stealing supplies, only for the culprit to be a bunch of square-tailed elves. As we've seen in the previous games, even though the Scoia'tael have a right to feel hard done by, they never go about rectifying the problem in a sympathetic way, and they are far too quick to kill people. When you report what happened to the nearby camp commander, he states that his men will go around and hang every 10th elf, confident that will solve the problem. Knowing that you've just condemned a lot of innocent elves to death is far from a comforting feeling. Or there's Defender of the Faith, which has Geralt repairing vandalised statues. Again, it's very much a simple quest that seems designed solely to give you something to do while you travel the map. However, when Geralt reaches the last one, he finds the culprit, who goes on about how religion is keeping people in ignorance, and given the actions of the major religions in the world, he kinda has a point. And you can see evidence of his point when a priest asks you to help him kill monsters on the battlefield, so that he can administer last rites to the bodies, except he's actually roping you in to help cover up some fist-tech deals gone wrong. One quest on Skellige served as a judgment of sorts based on Geralt's previous actions. Geralt is nearly killed by a large rock falling on his head, and he suspects it was no accident, something confirmed by drawings he finds that strangely seem to have been drawn by a child. The culprits are 4 beings, usually classed as monsters. There's a godling, a doppler, an ice troll, and a werewolf. The group wants to kill Geralt because he's a monster slayer and therefore kills people like them. Geralt points out that he doesn't kill sentient beings like them, and he has the chance to mention the good deeds he's done so far, like sparing a Doppler's life in Novigrad and helping another godling get his voice back. In my case, I was able to convince all but the werewolf, who insisted on fighting me. However, the other 3 were convinced that Geralt wasn't that bad after all. The Witcher 3 isn't as chock full of these choice and consequence moments as many RPGs, and the consequences it does have tend to be on the periphery instead of affecting the main story. Bearing in mind the length of the game and the relatively minor consequences of these choices, there isn't much motivation to complete multiple playthroughs. That's why I didn't complete the 3rd playthrough for this video. It simply didn't feel worth it. To be clear, that's not supposed to be a knock on a game that has already given me 200 hours of joy. The more significant choices give rise to a few images that Geralt talks over to explain the consequence of his actions, such as the rise of hatred for non-humans because he helped save the mages, or a blossoming relationship between Keira Metz and Lambert that only happened because Geralt helped Keira earlier and instructed her to go to Kaer Morhen. What's interesting is how hard it is to tell which actions will lead to moments like this. Take that Keira Metz choice. At the end of her storyline, you choose between letting her take the plague research to Radovid, recommending she head to Kaer Morhen, or fighting her to the death, which seems a little extreme. You can ask quite a few people to go to Kaer Morhen during the journey, and it's clear something big is going to happen there, which of course it does with the big battle. That was already more than enough choice and consequence for me, yet Keira's story doesn't end with that because she hooks up with Lambert and gets a few slides about the 2 of them going off together. Likewise, Geralt was only helping the mages to help Triss, which is a necessary step if you want to end up in a relationship with her. I didn't expect there to be a whole subplot about non-humans being persecuted as well. Even seemingly small decisions can have consequences later on, often much later on. Examples include saving a man who had been tied up and left for dead, only to bump into him again later when he's become the leader of a violent gang, or giving a witcher potion to a woman and then meeting her Nilfgaardian lover, who thanks you for helping even though he wishes maybe you didn't because her body couldn't handle the potion and has left her a mess. Or there's the priest who you humiliate in front of a crowd, only to get randomly jumped on by a gang later who tried to get revenge. There are so many examples of small actions coming back to have consequences later that I wouldn't be surprised if every one of Geralt's random acts, or the lack of random acts, has consequences and I just miss triggering some. Just because a decision doesn't trigger a further conflict doesn't mean there aren't consequences. For example, during the main story when Geralt has to go and see a dreamer, he is told by the owner of the house that it is haunted. Geralt uncovers the friendly godling who is just messing with people for fun and because she wants somewhere to live and no one else will have her. I decided to let her stay in the house and told the man outside there was nothing we could do to stop the haunting. The man was a merchant who had just bought the house and was complaining about losing money on the deal, but it was clear he could swallow the loss and I assumed that would be the end of it. Shortly after, on a notice board, I found a note from a very annoyed new owner of the house complaining that the merchant had swindled him by selling him a haunted house. Clearly the merchant decided to pass his own misfortune on to someone else. There are some moments where you crave a little more freedom than what's on offer, or when the choices don't feel quite right. For example, there's the Nithing quest where a woman has placed a curse on a young boy because she feels the father should be with her, and she's annoyed at him for going off with his new family. She agrees to remove the curse, but only if the man abandons his wife and child to come and live with her. A touch unreasonable, perhaps. The choice ends up being a little odd. Geralt can recommend that the man do as she says and go live with this clearly evil woman, or he can offer to deflect the curse back at her, killing her instead. This is the only other way to stop the curse. Now, clearly given the choice between letting an innocent young child die or this horrible woman die, I will let the woman die every time. As to whether he should volunteer to go and live with her instead is his choice, but I'm fine with saying the woman deserves to have the curse put back on her. What I don't understand is why we can't tell her that's what will happen. Geralt should be able to threaten her with the final choice. Remove the curse on the boy or die yourself. This is much better than giving the choice to the man. She might well remove it if the alternative is death. And sure, you could say she'll just do it again once Geralt has left, but that's basically the case with half of the quests. On a more minor note, I do like how the script often changes based on actions you may have already done. For example, I happened to go to Fyke Isle on a whim just because I was exploring and fancied heading over there early. I didn't complete any quests there, I just visited the isle and killed a few monsters. However, when Geralt was later tasked with visiting the island for a quest, he specifically stated that he'd already been there. This isn't the case with every interaction concerning locations you've already visited, but I was pleasantly surprised by how often it happened. The Bloody Baron has a Gwent card that you can win off him. However, if he dies in your playthrough, you can still get the card by finding a letter that leads you to his stash of cards. Similarly, if you don't complete a quest that needs Triss before she disappears in her effort to get the mages out of Novigrad, the quest will disappear from your journal, but then it will come back again later on once Triss is back in the story. Also, if you do help the mages, which makes the witch hunters turn against non-humans, Zoltan won't be able to help you in some of the quests because he is persecuted if he steps out in public. Also, Geralt shows examples of independent thought beyond what's been laid down in the main quest lines. Take for example the section of the main story where you need to find Dudu, a Doppler, to have him assume the form of Menga as part of Geralt's plan to free Dandelion. Before completing that quest, I happened to take on a monster contract that happened to lead me to a Doppler. The Doppler hadn't actually done much wrong, so Geralt was happy to let him go. But what really impressed me was the option to have Geralt ask this Doppler to help him with the Menga impersonation. It never occurred to me to ask this. I'm playing a game with a quest structure, and this is a separate quest from the one that has me hunt down Dudu, so of course this Doppler isn't going to suffice. But Geralt doesn't know that. He needs a Doppler. There's no obvious reason why this one won't do just as well. Unfortunately, the game doesn't go further and let you use this Doppler instead of Dudu, which would have been ideal, but I still love how Geralt tried. Little things like this go a long way to avoid breaking the illusion that you're living in a world instead of playing a game. Of course, when this sort of thing doesn't happen, it can break the spell a bit. At one point, Geralt comes across a couple of traders who are heading to Crow's Perch, hoping to do business with the Bloody Baron. You'd think Geralt would be able to tell them that the Bloody Baron is dead, but that is not an option. You can tell there's some dialogue covering the situation if he is alive, because there's an awkward cut showing something being taken out. There's just nothing to replace it if he's dead. This seems a little odd given how the Bloody Baron storyline is one of the most important in the game, and that other far less significant scenarios were catered for. Another minor error in the Bloody Baron questline is that despite the Baron's constant insistence that he won't give you all the information on Ciri until you've brought his wife and daughter back, he does seem to forget about his daughter who is hiding out in Oxenfurt once you are ready to get the wife back, almost as if he knows he's going to end up seeing his daughter once they get there, and of course he does. One annoying situation with a stark lack of choice popped up on Skellige when I was dealing with a nasty piece of work who had something I needed to continue. I could have attacked him during the conversation and resolved the quest another way, but I figured it'd be better to get the item from him and then kill him anyway. Except you can't kill him afterwards. He's invincible, as are his mates. I actually got more of a reaction from the nearby guards just for having my sword out than I did swinging it through these people. I tried a similar trick on his werewolf friend and it worked on him, thankfully. The Witcher series sold more and more with each entry, but I think it's fair to say the series exploded with the third game. As of June 2019, The Witcher 3 had broken through the 20 million copies sold mark, and that doesn't include the bump it got from the Switch release or the Netflix series. I still often see it in the Steam charts when it goes on sale, leaving me to wonder who out there is still buying it at this point. As you can tell from the number of copies sold, the third Witcher game reached way beyond the niche PC audience of the first game, or the casual RPG audience of the second. It's a mainstream game with mainstream appeal, and with it mainstream expectations around how it should play. This has led to a fairly extreme but widely held opinion that the combat is terrible. You don't have to look far for comments along the lines of, the story is good but I got bored playing it, that kind of thing. I'm sure there will be plenty of people saying that in the comments here. And they aren't wrong, by the way, it's an opinion. If people say they don't enjoy a thing or they think a thing is bad, then they are inherently correct because that is their opinion. I even agree that the combat is incredibly flawed. The reason I defend the combat against accusations of it being terrible or something that ruins the game comes in large part from my expectations. Expectations are important. I've discussed this before, I think it was in my Metro 2033 video, but basically what you think a game is going to be like affects your experience with that game. At the extreme end, your expectations may mean you fight against the experience on offer the entire time and end up hating the thing. For example, let's say you loved the combat of Bloodborne, which happened to be your first From Software game, and then you went back to play Dark Souls with that same mindset for aggressive combat. You might not have a good time. Or let's face it, you want every game that has a sword in it to play like Dark Souls, which is probably where a lot of the criticism for Witcher 3 comes from. Ideally, of course, you would pick up on the signs that you aren't supposed to play in the same way, and you'd adapt accordingly, but we're all human and frankly some games are better at explaining how they want to be played than others. Doom 2016 came as a refreshing shock to the system compared to many FPS games of the 10 years before it, and it did a good job teaching you to play differently by removing aim down sights and rewarding you for glory kills, which in turn required you to stay in the midst of the action. So expectations are important. They shouldn't be used as an excuse, however. I often see people defending a flaw in a game by saying, well, the developers made it clear it was going to be X, or they weren't trying to do Y, as if this shuts down any criticism. Actually, the phrase, well, the developers said blah blah blah, is starting to challenge but in the law as one of my most hated phrases. It's important to note that when I say the combat in The Witcher 3 is okay for an RPG, that's not an excuse for it not being better. It's the reason my expectations were as they were, and the reason why my opinion came out as it did. I do think bad is a bit of an exaggeration anyway. To me, bad would suggest the combat actively takes something away from the game by being broken or frustrating in some way. The combat in The Witcher 3 might not add much to the experience, but I don't think it detracts from it either. Combat in The Witcher 3 is closer to an action game than it was in the previous two. There are light and heavy attacks, a parry, a block, a dodge and a longer roll. The addition of a dodge means it's easier to stay close to your opponent while also evading damage. You don't have to commit to a lengthy roll animation that will likely see you far away from the enemy, or do that weird thing where you make Geralt turn while rolling, like a bowling ball with a lot of spin on it. Otherwise your options are similar, with the 5 main Witcher signs present and correct. So why does it feel so different? The main reason is the ability to cancel out all of Geralt's attack animations. In The Witcher 2, if you committed to an attack, you had to see that attack through. In the third game, you can cancel out with a quick dodge or even use a sign instead. Plus, the animations are generally a lot quicker. For example, using Quen in The Witcher 2 involved a lengthy animation. While Quen became active after around 50 frames when playing at 60 frames a second, the actual animation lasted around 90 frames or 1.5 seconds. This meant using Quen in the midst of a hectic battle was a big commitment. In The Witcher 3, Quen becomes active after around 25 frames and the animation completes after about 50 frames. This makes a huge difference to your combat approach, because you don't need to create as much space between Geralt and the enemy to recharge Quen. I don't mind tweaks that make the combat easier, that can always be compensated for in other ways. The change I don't really like is how the game takes control away from the player so often, and does most of the work for you. You can just keep tapping one of the attack buttons and Geralt will leap from enemy to enemy and back again without you having to aim at any one particular person or put much thought into it. It feels a bit like the early Assassin's Creed games until Ubisoft changed things up with Origins. Geralt has little weight and the way he springs around with no effort is incredibly unrealistic. This wouldn't be so bad if he moved like a Witcher is supposed to move, but it doesn't even feel like he's doing that. There are pirouettes and the like, but he isn't grounded enough and his attacks remind me of the combat scenes in television shows like Arrow. I won't show any footage for risk of copyright strikes, but basically Green Arrow and his mates attack in ways that are clearly ridiculous but designed to look flashy on camera, so long as you don't actually think about it. If a guy is on the floor, instead of kicking him, they will jump and spin in the air and kind of land on them in a way that clearly wouldn't hurt that much at all. A bit like wrestling, I guess. Geralt's actions aren't quite that extreme, but he'll often spin and leap into the air for attacks that blatantly leave his back open. You're left feeling like you're playing as a superhero, when I always think of Witchers as more like phenomenal fighters who are stronger and quicker than regular people, but who still have to obey gravity and the like. As with similar action games, this style of bouncing from foe to foe can make the combat look spectacular while feeling relatively effortless. Even though the combat systems of the first two games are dramatically different, in both of those I would always focus on Geralt's positioning. In the first game you wanted to be in a position to hit multiple enemies with your swings, but you had to be on the lookout for backstabs that did extra damage. In The Witcher 2, the slow speed of your animations and the lack of the ability to cancel out of them meant you always needed to have an exit route in mind, a way to gain space when you wanted to use Quen, for example. In The Witcher 3, I gave no thought to my positioning because you can't really control it, especially in any kind of group encounter. You can put a lot of thought into circling an enemy to pull off a backstab only to see Geralt attack someone else instead. Or you can have all the enemies in front of you only for Geralt to leap into the middle of them to attack a random guy and leave himself completely exposed. All in all, this makes it difficult to get into any kind of combat flow, despite the fact that's exactly what the game wants you to feel. Take this example where I'm fighting a couple of Endregers. I'm focused on the large one and I know he's about to attack. The plan is to dodge the attack and then get an attack of my own in from the side or behind. However, the dodge sends me closer to another smaller enemy, so the game thinks I want to attack that one instead and switches priority. I was even trying to turn the camera while dodging to keep the focus on the big guy, but the lock-on breaks automatically as it does nearly all the time. That's nearly all the time because of course sometimes you want the lock-on to break and yet it stubbornly remains, like in this situation with 3 enemies where Geralt insists on attacking the one furthest away. Making a conscious effort to focus on particular enemies often ends in frustration, and I recommend you just accept that Geralt will attack who he wants to attack and not who you want him to attack. It's just less stressful that way. It might get you killed sometimes though. It wasn't all that uncommon for Geralt to go veering off in a stupid direction and literally plant himself right in the way of a swinging sword. All in all, it's fair to say the sword combat is arcadey of sorts. It's certainly not attempting to be a simulation or a grounded representation of sword combat. Another major issue is the general lack of enemy animations for their attacks, which in theory would make combat harder, except their attack patterns are so predictable that you don't need animations to know when to dodge or block. Take the Drowners for example. Their own attacks don't have much in the way of animation tells. However, they attack so predictably that you know you can always get 2 hits in, maybe 3 if you're quick, and then dodge out of the way of their attack, which you know is coming. You end up in a rhythm that isn't actually dissimilar to the first game where you essentially attack and dodge without thinking about any of it. The faster pace of combat and shorter animations means hit detection isn't as frustrating as it was in The Witcher 2 because you're simply less likely to notice it. Hit detection is far from perfect, but it's close enough that it probably won't feel annoying during fights. That said, AoE attacks like the Rot Fiends exploding when they die sometimes have a rather exaggerated range. Some attacks also go through Quen instead of breaking it, although this is incredibly rare. A slight annoyance is that many enemies can break Quen with a little shove, which can be hard to see in the heat of combat. I understand this as a way to create distance between Geralt and the enemy, but for it to break Quen seems extreme. When you see Quen break without seeing a corresponding attack, you start to wonder whether there's a lone archer taking pot shots at you from off the screen. Largely though, with everything moving so quickly it can be hard to spot the issues with hit detection, and it feels more nitpicky to focus on than it did in the last game. For the most part, it's the sort of thing you only notice when combing through video footage and not while playing. As before, there are 5 signs: Igni for fire, Ard for push, Axii for mind control, Quen for a protective barrier, and Yarden for a magic trap. The signs all work really quickly and are useful even if you don't focus on signs in your build. Obviously I did use Quen a fair bit, however I found myself using the whole spread of signs on a regular basis. Certainly a lot more so than I did in the previous games where I had a tendency to focus on just 1 or 2 signs. I'd like to say this is due to the variety of enemy types demanding a change of approach, but that wasn't the case outside of obvious situations like trapping wraiths with Yarden or knocking aerial enemies out of the sky with Ard. Fire is nearly always a good bet, and while a few enemies are weak to Axii, I mainly just use that one to help manage crowds of enemies. In addition to health and stamina, Geralt also has an adrenaline meter, which could become your most valuable ability during combat, or it could be something you completely ignore like I did for 80 hours back in 2015. The adrenaline meter is poorly explained in the game, which doesn't help. You build up the meter by attacking and lose it by not attacking. That's nice and simple. The problem is the meter doesn't do anything unless you activate a skill that uses it, and at the start you don't have any of those skills. By spending skill points you can unlock skills like Undying, but use adrenaline points to keep Geralt alive for a bit after he's lost all his health, or Deadly Precision, which increases the percentage chance of getting an instant kill. In my case, I was going with an alchemy build, and there weren't many interesting uses of adrenaline to unlock within that build, other than the hunter instincts, which buffs critical hit damage if you're using the correct oil type on your sword. That is obviously incredibly useful, but I think the way the meter is introduced and present during combat long before you can do anything with it is kinda confusing, and you can go a long time, or even the entire game, without unlocking a skill that makes any use of it. The most interesting part of combat isn't so much the fights as it is the preparation. The crafting of oils and potions, finding or crafting gear, and levelling up Geralt to excel in particular areas. As in the previous games, Geralt can apply oils to his 2 blades, steel for humans and animals, and silver for monsters, and he can drink potions for health, stamina and attack benefits. Gear can be found in the wild, although the best stuff needs to be crafted via blacksmiths. So far so similar to the previous 2 games, and there's clearly more than enough here for a solid RPG combat system, even if we ignore the slightly silly way Geralt moves around in fights. The swordplay doesn't have to be realistic to create a good combat system, and with all the variables in play here, The Witcher 3 could easily provide a stimulating challenge that makes up for a few inadequacies elsewhere. Unfortunately, it doesn't, and the lack of challenge bugs me far more than the floaty combat. None of the Witcher games have been especially challenging. Witcher 3 is easier than Witcher 2, which in turn was easier than Witcher 1, assuming they're all played on their hardest difficulty setting. All 3 games follow a pattern of being tough at the start and getting progressively easier. That is even more so with the 3rd game, which perhaps in its desire to appeal to a more mainstream audience has foregone nearly any semblance of challenge, and as such I felt less like a Witcher while role-playing than in any other game in the series. I played on the hardest difficulty setting, Deathmarch, both when I originally played back in 2015 and when I played again for this video. In addition to the usual stuff like enemies having more health, Geralt taking more damage and the like, Geralt also doesn't regain health while meditating. For about 5 to 10 hours, Deathmarch difficulty is excellent and provides a solid enough challenge that, even though this sounds cliche, you do feel like a Witcher in a dangerous world, especially when tackling the monster contracts. Without any kind of regenerating health, and before you've learned how to craft health potions, you'll be stuck scrounging for scraps of food and spending every last bit of coin on some nice cooked meat. I was genuinely nervous when I went into those early monster fights and the battle against the Royal Griffin. The monsters have big health bars that you have to chip away at, and 1 or 2 hits from them can kill. The fights can drag on and the tension doesn't let up, so when you do inflict the final hit, there is that feeling of elation you get from other games notorious for tough boss battles. The sweet spot is when Geralt is roughly levels 3 to 6. Before then you feel ridiculously weak, like you're swinging a wooden sword, but at around levels 3 to 6, which represent quite a few hours of playtime, I'd say the game is balanced close to perfect, or at least close to perfect for me. You can even engineer your own boss battles of sorts. There are a scattering of high level enemies in Velen, especially around guarded treasure chests, and these one-on-one fights can be as long as any boss battle. I still remember a fight back in my 2015 playthrough when I was a level 8 and I took on a level 20 beast. The fight dragged on a long time and it was probably a bit silly on my part, but I appreciated how you could defeat these enemies if you wanted to. Any enemy that's more than 5 or 6 levels above you has a skull icon and typically only takes chip damage. They are beatable though. I had a good fight against a level 20 Leshen when I was only level 10, although strangely this Leshen shouldn't have been here. I died in the fight and came back and it was only level 11, which is what it was always supposed to be given the quest level. The chip damage problem can be solved to some extent by using the Archgriffin decoction, which makes Geralt deal 5% of an enemy's health and damage with each strong attack, so long as Geralt has some stamina. 20 strong attacks to defeat an enemy is still a lot, but it's less than the alternative. Mind you, I didn't get this decoction until I completed the Master Armourer quest while about level 30, and it wasn't much use by that point because there weren't any enemies with a far higher level to challenge. Encounters with multiple enemies are appropriately difficult, and I enjoyed fighting groups of human opponents during those early levels. I stumbled upon a bandit camp at about level 4 and was able to take out a group of level 7 bandits by patiently drawing them from the crowd and positioning myself out of line of sight of any crossbow wielders. You need to keep your wits about you a bit to make sure you parry all incoming attacks and get your own in when you can. As much as I'd like to take credit for taking on a large group of enemies almost double my level, this encounter did show up one of the crucial flaws with enemy AI, namely their limited range of vision. While enemies will persistently chase you down, a couple of lengthy rolls or a bit of sprinting will get you far enough from them that they will turn around and give up. As you can imagine, this is pretty easy to abuse. Fighting a group of enemies is challenging when they all attack together, Fighting them one by one is not especially difficult, and even less so if you have a bunch of food to replenish health between each fight. It's also not uncommon for a few stray bandits to just not notice the big fight and hang out on the edge ignoring everything. In one case, Geralt looted a camp he thought was empty and then meditated and was heading away only to find there'd been an enemy there the entire time. Stuff like this is a relatively minor problem. What game doesn't have AI you can abuse the hell out of if you really want? The major problem is how easy it is to become way too powerful and borderline invincible after, say, 20 hours, maybe less. I died a lot early on, but for at least 4/5 of my playtime, deaths were rare, and usually just a result of me getting cocky. Unless this all sound like a humble brag of sorts, I want you to pay attention to the footage for the next few minutes, and note how imperfectly I'm playing. I'm not going to deliberately pick my worst moments or my best, it will just be random combat footage. I'm borderline bad at times. I played on the hardest difficulty available, and the game never forced me to get good, so to speak. I'm about to describe how the systems work and how easy it can be to become overpowered, but note that I don't particularly practice what I preach. I was bad at parrying and over-reliant on Quen for defense. I sometimes didn't bother to change oils based on the enemy I was fighting. I didn't maximise use of the potions I spent so long learning how to craft. I don't expect a game to make me play perfectly, but at this level I expect to have to play sensibly. I expect to be punished for schoolboy mistakes. I don't expect to be able to take on enemies well above my character and gear level unless I'm at the top of my game. Looking back at the footage was actually a touch embarrassing. I couldn't believe how badly I was playing in some of the clips, even near the late game. It's not all just a case of getting hit when I shouldn't. I found a couple of decent potions and generally stuck with them, even if more suitable alternatives were available for the fight. I did silly little things like leaving decoctions in the quick use slots even though they last for an hour and you only have one use of them, as opposed to up to 5 with potions. When playing on the hardest difficulty and playing an alchemy based build, which I'll discuss shortly, you should need to use your potions to the maximum benefit in nearly every major fight, and yet more often than not I just pop them for the hell of it or because I hadn't used them in a while. Anyone who has played the game can probably tell how inefficient I'm being from the footage. Hell, I invite you to point out my inadequacies in the comments, you'll do it anyway, because that just supports the overall point that this is too easy. There are two main reasons for The Witcher 3's difficulty or lack thereof. The first problem is once again Quen, which grants you a shield to protect against one hit, at least. You can level it up to be even more useful than it already is, but I didn't bother. I talked about this in the Witcher 2 video and the concept is fairly easy to understand, so I won't dwell on it. Basically, Quen lets you make a lot of mistakes. Once equipped, you don't need to worry about taking damage until you're hit and the shield breaks. This teaches you to be a little careless. From the very first fight until the last, you don't have to miss all enemy attacks because you can keep reactivating Quen once you've lost it and never really have to worry about health. Admittedly, you can't just spam Quen. There is a stamina regeneration system, and while it's fairly quick, if you lose Quen immediately after activating it, there will be a wait time before you can use it again. During this period, you're vulnerable. You may also want to use that stamina on other signs. Yarden is particularly important against wraiths, and Ard is great against any flying enemy. It's rarely essential to use other signs, but my desire to save stamina to knock an enemy out of the air, for example, was one of the main reasons I would occasionally take care during combat. The other main reason combat lacks challenge is how easy it is to become overpowered through an alchemy build. There are 3 main categories to invest skill points in: combat, signs and alchemy. You get 1 skill point per level and a bonus one each time you find a new place of power. Throughout my playthroughs of the Witcher games, I've experimented quite a bit with sign and combat builds, but I'd never gone with a full alchemy build because frankly those games never motivated me to. The best upgrades were always in the other categories. In my 2015 playthrough of Witcher 3, I focused on a combination of sign and combat abilities with a lot of points spent on Quen, because I figured I would need that playing on Deathmarch. This time around I knew that wasn't necessary and I wanted to go all in on the alchemy. Well, almost all in. I spent some points to get a basic buff to fast attacks because you'd be crazy not to buff either your fast or strong attacks. That's a bit of an issue actually. Unless you go with a full combat build, you likely won't have the points to buff fast and strong attacks to the max, so you'll pick one to buff and that will become the attack you always use. I upgraded the use of Axii in conversations because I always like seeing how much I can talk my way out of combat. Occasionally a prompt will pop up during a conversation and Geralt will do a little hand wavy thing and convince someone to do what he wants. However, and this is the cool part in my opinion, if you try to use this on someone with a group of people around them, it often won't work. Their friends see you doing magic and are usually pretty displeased about the fact. This feels like one of those nice extra touches that not all devs would have gone to the effort of implementing.
Leave the puffins alone.
Aye, we will. Alone.
What the hell? Black magic! He's a fucking witch! Get him!
For those who don't know, oils are what you apply to your blades, with different oils being especially effective against different monster types, e.g. you use necrophage oil when fighting drowners. Oils last for a given number of hits on an enemy. Potions are drinks that Geralt consumes which generally provide buffs like health and stamina regeneration, although some serve a specific purpose like clearing toxicity or immunity to a poisonous mould. Most potions have about 3 uses at first, and they are replenished by meditating so long as you have alcohol on you. And you can meditate basically any time you're not in combat. Decoctions are similar to potions but tend to provide a bigger benefit but in more specific circumstances, and you only get one use until they have to be refilled. For example, the Wraith decoction provides an instant Quen shield if an attack takes more than 1/3 of Geralt's health. Drinking potions and decoctions builds up toxicity, and when you hit 95% toxicity, Geralt starts to lose health. This is another system that I don't think is especially well explained, but you also don't need to know the ins and outs. All you need to know is that drinking potions and decoctions adds to toxicity and you don't want it to get too high. Putting skill points into the alchemy build improves your toxicity tolerance and lets you take more potions at any one time. Oils, potions and decoctions need to be crafted using a variety of ingredients like herbs, alcohol and monster parts. And decoctions are similar but they need a specific part from the monster that makes up the decoction. So a Griffin decoction requires a Griffin mutagen. One slight niggle is that there are succubus and Doppler decoctions and yet not many opportunities to get the mutagens you need to make them. The Dopplers I met were all nice people who didn't deserve to die, likewise the succubus. Other than these 2 decoctions, I unlocked every potion, oil and bomb up to its maximum level. Before crafting anything you need to either find the recipe out in the wild or buy it from a merchant. Again, early on this all feels pretty good. You slowly find new recipes and make an effort to gather the required resources, in other words you go and pick plants, and you craft yourself a new oil or potion. The potions you come across early on likely won't be all that powerful either. One of your first will be Swallow, which is basic health regeneration, and not much more efficient than eating high quality food. Where The Witcher 3 stumbles is in its attempts to overly gamify all this. In the first 2 games you only created each potion or oil once. In The Witcher 3 the potions and oils have their own upgrade systems, which means you never have to go long without upgrading something or other, and of course that's the point. It's a reward loop of sorts, and like many reward loops it can feel satisfying. It's not all that well implemented though. There are artificial points of scarcity, such as when you suddenly need white gull as an alcohol base for everything, and not many places sell it. To craft your own white gull you need cherry cordial, Redanian herbal and mandrake cordial, all of which are also relatively scarce and disproportionately expensive when you consider what other things cost and the amount you get for killing monsters. It's not like these are even special fancy wines either. They can be found in small inns and out of the way places, but you don't know which places have them, and so you have to check everyone's inventory in case they have any. I ended up having to write down the few places I found that sold the stuff I needed, and then I travelled back and forth when I had the money in the hope they'd restocked. The system is designed to stop you from levelling up the potions and oils too quickly, but the roadblocks are pretty cheap. I also wish there was an in-game resource that recorded where certain herbs were growing, so if you needed a particular one you would know where to find it, like a bestiary for herbs. I prefer the way the decoctions handle it by making you kill a certain enemy type. There are similar roadblocks in the gear quests. You can stumble on the special Witcher gear randomly, however given the size of the world you're obviously much better off using a map. Except each map is in the hands of specific blacksmiths, which means you end up talking to every one of them just in case they have a map you need. More to the point though, these upgrades aren't about obtaining knowledge or doing anything interesting. I found most of the upgrade recipes by just randomly looting on my travels, and the rest I was able to buy from herbalists and other merchants. Obviously with this many different oils and potions, plus the upgrades for those oils and potions, there can't be a special quest or unique item to find for all of them. But that's kind of the point, there shouldn't be so many, less is more. This is even more important when you consider the impact on balancing. Even the Death March difficulty seems to have been built around the assumption that players would acquire the oils and most of the potions, but not upgrade them. Once upgraded, some of these are incredibly powerful. Using superior versions of oils absolutely wrecks monsters, and human enemies fall apart when you have superior Hanged Man's venom on your sword. Enemies' health bars scale up as they increase in level, however that only appears to be relative to Geralt's level and gear stats. Their health doesn't seem to reflect the potential for Geralt to be applying superior oil to his blade. Something needed to change here. Enemies should either have been tougher or borderline invincible until you had a higher level oil, or there shouldn't have been higher level oils at all. Or maybe the upgrades should just be much harder to get. The potions are absolutely insane when leveled up. Take Golden Oriole as an example. This one protects Geralt against poison damage, which obviously has a very specific use. There are enemies that do poison damage, and knowing about that in advance and preparing accordingly is satisfying. You'd think it would end there. Maybe the protection could last longer when upgraded, or you'd get more uses, both of which do happen. However, when upgraded to Superior, this potion makes poison heal Geralt. Enemies that do poison damage are not only now less effective, they are practically impotent. Their attacks heal you, so even if you do get hit by a stray melee attack, you'll soon recover. When combined with the decoctions, there are so many potential buffs that a lot of them overlap or basically do the same thing. Swallow and Full Moon both aid vitality as potions, and White Rafford's decoction does so as a decoction. Oh, and if you spend your skill points in the right places, you can get boosts to vitality no matter what decoction you drink. Sure, you get limited number of uses until you have to meditate, but meditating is easy and alcohol is plentiful. The first Witcher game made Geralt meditate in specific spots to replenish potions, and while this might have been trickier to implement in such a large world, I would have appreciated a similar limitation here. Or maybe a limitation on how often you can meditate or replenish potions during one day, or have replenishing potions be more expensive. Anything really. As it stands, they might as well automatically replenish after every combat encounter for all the effort it takes. Once you have a full loadout of potions, it becomes genuinely difficult to fail. Imagine you're struggling with one particular combat encounter. You don't have a problem dealing damage, but you take too many hits and die. You can get good, or you can just use all your health items. You can have up to 5 Swallow potions and White Rafford's decoction, not to mention a bunch of food all on hand. These can be consumed from the pause screen or quick slots, so there's no risk to consuming them. The only downside is they replenish health over time, so the buff may come too late. But generally, if you have all this available health at your disposal and you're still dying, there's probably a bigger problem somewhere else. By the way, unlike the first game, you can also apply oil to your blades during combat without Geralt going through any animation. I don't think CD Projekt Red has ever quite got this right. Ideally, you should have to apply an oil before combat. It's part of combat preparation. This works when you're given an opportunity to prepare for the fight, which you usually were in the first game. There were times when you weren't, such as the early beast fight, but that one was the exception. I prefer a system where you should apply the oil before a fight and are punished for applying it during combat. That's not the case here, which makes one of the major upgrade benefits completely pointless. As you level up the oils, Geralt can deal more hits with the oil before it needs to be reapplied. But unlike potions, oil doesn't have a limited number of applications, so you can simply pause the game and go into your inventory to apply more whenever you run out. The only disadvantage I found from doing this was that the act of moving my hand to the escape key to get out of the inventory menu meant I was not prepared to immediately resume fighting. Not much of a punishment, is it? As you might expect, an alchemy build enhances your ability to use and benefit from potions. Many of the buffs don't sound all that exciting and don't lead to new abilities or talents, but the increases to toxicity are crucial, and I highly recommend getting the early skill that provides a chance to deal poison damage with every attack. And there's protective coating, which provides damage resistance so long as you're using the correct oil for the opponent you're fighting. I can certainly understand why people would ignore the alchemy tree though, because it doesn't sound all that sexy. When you look at the skill tree early on, it's full of very small increases to your toxicity threshold, changes to the consequences of going over the threshold and that kind of thing. Bear in mind it will take a while for you to have enough potions to even make you capable of going over the toxicity threshold, let alone fully understanding how it works. So I wouldn't blame anyone for focusing on combat or signs. The alchemy stuff really adds up though. For example, acquired tolerance buffs your toxicity by 1 for every level 1 alchemical recipe you know, and it extends the duration of potions by 5%. If you spend 3 skill points on this skill, you'll get extra toxicity for every level 1, 2 or 3 alchemical recipe, so all of them at every level, and you'll get extra potion duration of 15%. I'm not sure of the exact amount of recipes yet because there might be some in the DLC I don't have, but I know you can get at least 150. Which takes toxicity to 250 plus from a base of 100. That's a huge difference, and given that you'll be learning recipes anyway regardless of how you play the game, it's a skill you might as well invest in and keep active. I say keep active because you have to slot skills into a limited number of active slots to get the benefit of them. There are a total of 12 slots that open slowly as you level up. This limitation obviously means you're better off focusing on a select number of skills and investing points to the cap, which is usually 3 or 5 per skill, than you are spreading your skill points around. I liked limiting my focus to a handful of skills because I think the more I opened up, the more confusing it became when I started to think about how they were all interacting. Oh, and by adding mutagens of the right colour, you can get a good buff to base stats, so you'll want to group the skills by type. Ciri's sections don't have any of the oils or potions, and they aren't especially interesting or challenging. She can regenerate health, has loads of iframes during her dash, and can slice through monsters in 1 or 2 hits. That's not to say these sections can't be a little annoying, mind you. Perhaps as a consequence of not having a mini-map on screen, I wasn't always clear when Ciri was supposed to run instead of fight. I was ploughing through Hounds of the Wild Hunt for bloody ages in one case. If you head in the wrong direction, then expect to get killed in 1 hit as punishment. It should also be noted that there is the option to make enemies scale up to your level, so you never have any easy fights. I didn't use this until my 3rd playthrough because generally I don't like basic enemy scaling, it tends to feel a bit lazy. And anyway, the problem with the lack of challenge is more that the hardest enemies aren't hard enough, not that the lower enemies are too easy. What's most disappointing about Witcher 3's lack of difficulty is that there is a built-in set of optional missions that provide the perfect opportunity to up the challenge. The monster contracts are the 3rd tier of content after main quests and side quests. They are the missions that come closest to recreating the day-to-day life for a Witcher, and they do a good job capturing the spirit of the first 2 novels especially. However, they are also easier to ignore than the side quests, which often have a knock-on effect on the main quest, such as who is available to help at the Battle of Kaer Morhen. There are also a lot of monster contracts, so you don't need to do all of them or feel bad if some of them are too hard or if you can't deal enough damage to enemies like werewolves who can heal and effectively act as DPS checks, or the wraiths who heal while you deal with minions they've summoned. So with that in mind, why are the monster contracts so frustratingly easy? To a certain extent, the problem is that there's a limit to how difficult the combat can be in a one-on-one fight, given the issues already discussed, such as Geralt having access to Quen. When a single enemy has to hit you twice in quick succession to deal damage, you're always going to have an advantage, and that's not to mention all the other potential benefits you can apply, such as the Black Blood Potion that deals damage to vampires when they attack you, or Golden Oriole to make poison attacks heal you. The Black Blood Potion is a cool idea, but there is also an oil that is effective against vampires. If you have both the potion and oil leveled up, then a fight against a vampire is going to be a pushover regardless of level. Even accepting that the combat system for one-on-one fights is limited in challenge, there are other ways CD Projekt Red could have made the player work a little harder. For example, the monster contracts don't pit you against unique monster types. Here's how the contracts work. You use Witcher senses to track a bunch of clues, and Geralt deduces what type of monster it is. The monster is usually given a different entry in the bestiary with a different name, however they are not a unique type of monster. Morvad is a fiend, Abaya is a water hag, Kernan is a leshen, etc. As a result, once Geralt identifies the type of monster he has to fight, he likely has all the information he needs on the strengths and weaknesses of that creature, assuming that monster type has already been unlocked in the bestiary. It almost certainly has been, because you only need to defeat one example of an enemy to unlock the bestiary entry. Even if you don't follow the clues to properly identify the monster type, you'll be able to identify it just from guessing, because a water hag in a monster contract looks and acts the same as any other water hag. They don't have any unique strengths or abilities as far as I can tell, beyond a larger health bar. It's probably unfair to demand a completely new and unused monster type for each contract, but perhaps a little more thought could have been put into the order these contracts appear, so that when you fight a wraith it's the first time you fought one, and likewise a vampire. It's hard to get all that excited when the investigation leads to yet another lesson. Ideally, and more feasibly, we'd get a return to how monsters were treated in the first game, where you had to go through a lot of effort to determine their weaknesses. In The Witcher 1 you had to recover multiple body parts from monsters to identify their weaknesses. You never had to farm them as such, but you certainly had to kill more than one. Alternatively, you could buy the fairly expensive books about those animals to fill in a few gaps. You had to put effort into learning the best way to kill a certain type of monster. As an example of how this could work, let's say Geralt does his little investigation thing where he examines tracks in the mud and follows strange smells until he identifies that the beast in question is a fire troll. That's all well and good, but Geralt has only fought one fire troll to date, and his bestiary entry is therefore either empty or thin on details. After asking around at the local village, Geralt finds out that less deadly fire trolls are known to inhabit a nearby cave. If he goes and kills all of them, he will complete the bestiary entry, find out all the strengths and weaknesses, and be ready to take on a more powerful troll with a bigger health bar. Although those trolls didn't do anything wrong, so maybe he should buy a book that has the same information. Ideally, the fire troll in the monster contract would have a unique attack distinct from other fire trolls, or he'd be immune to something that other fire trolls are weak to keep things interesting. This approach wouldn't necessarily make the encounters that much tougher, but they would be more involved and players could at least take some pride in the effort they went to get the information that then made the fight easy. I like how, for the most part, monster weaknesses have remained the same across all 3 games. I suppose in some cases this means people can sort of cheat by knowing monster weaknesses from previous games, but that's besides the point. It's also not 100% consistent. For example, Kikimores are now susceptible to Igni, whereas they weren't in the first game. Well, no more than every other monster was anyway. A minor point, but I didn't love how you were sometimes given these quests well before you were able to take them on. For example, I was given a level 33 contract when Geralt was level 3. I didn't reach level 33 until right near the end of the game, although I was able to complete this contract quite a bit before that. There was nothing special about the fight, it was just another Arrakis. It felt like such a huge anti-climax for a quest that had been in my journal for about 90 hours, and that's not to mention the lack of XP reward. XP rewarded on completion of a quest is incredibly low for all but the main quests, and it's reduced if you're over leveled. You literally get just 1 XP for completing some quests. CD Projekt Red probably bit off a bit more than it could chew with these monster contracts because there are just too many. You get to keep the monster's head as a trophy upon completing each one, and these trophies offer perks, but there weren't enough unique perks to go round. They ended up having a bunch of repeated ones. The lack of imagination in quest design is a problem across the entire game. While I loved a lot of the stories around the quests, the actual quests themselves are far too often just a case of holding down the button for Witcher senses, interacting with a few items near a dead body, and then following a trail of highlighted footprints and or a smell. It's amazing how often people, not just monsters, leave a distinctive smell behind. I don't mind the whole fisheye effect you get when using Witcher senses. I prefer it to the complete black and white image you get in some games. I like the idea that by concentrating on other senses such as sound or smell or focusing your eyesight on things in the immediate vicinity, you lose focus on everything else. I do wish there was a way to tone down the red stuff a bit though. You can't turn it off within the game, and while there might be mods to do it, you are then screwed in a lot of missions because the quest design doesn't work without it. Finding nearby objects to investigate would be easy enough even without the red highlighting, but most of the trails can't be found or followed without Witcher senses. This is a bit annoying when it comes to footprints. Sometimes you can see them yourself, especially when you're tracking a large monster, but most people or smaller creatures don't leave tracks that you can see with the naked eye. This does seem like something that could have been implemented better so that players could have chosen to follow the actual footprints instead of the red highlights. If this sounds like a pointless distinction, then it's worth noting that when you use your Witcher senses to follow these trails, your map, or in my case the floating quest marker, is automatically updated with a new destination. So you don't even need to follow the footprints or the smell, you just follow the quest marker as it keeps moving. The fact that so many of the quests require so little thought from the player is a step back from the previous games, especially again Witcher 1. This is best illustrated by comparing the autopsy quests in Witchers 1 and 3. When Geralt had to perform an autopsy in Witcher 1, he was tasked with educating himself on certain areas like herbology, and then using this information to make educated guesses about the cause of death. It was very possible to get the answer wrong, and the game wouldn't tell you this until you progressed with the quest and found out the hard way. I loved this. Geralt has to perform an autopsy in The Witcher 3, which involves selecting parts of the body from a list and having Geralt voice what he discovers until he comes to a fixed conclusion. Actually, the rest of this quest shows other examples of how the game is terrified of leaving players to think for themselves. You're trying to track down a vicious murderer who happens to leave clues to his next victim. This would be good if we had to figure any of it out for ourselves. I'm not asking for the quest to be completely open-ended. For example, the clue could point Geralt in the direction of 3 possible suspects, and it would be up to the player to apprehend the correct person based on finding other pieces of evidence. If Geralt goes to the right place first time, then he gets there before the victim is seriously hurt, although the murderer will be able to escape. If he goes there second, then the torture has started, but he is able to at least prevent the murder. If he goes there last, then it's too late and there's another murder. Anything to make investigations feel like actual investigations. There are also a few incredibly weak attempts at puzzles, although they are so dire they are barely worth discussion. The only memorable one has you rotating statues, and I only remember it because I solved it without even understanding what I was supposed to do. There are hints that CD Projekt Red wanted to let the player do more and perhaps pulled back at the last minute, afraid of making things too difficult or confusing. For example, during one mission you find a note from Dandelion which is presumably addressed to Ciri. He tells her to try the wine from the year of her birth and then to place it back in the wine rack. It's obvious that doing so will unlock a secret of some kind. Conveniently, there happens to be a note that states Ciri's year of birth, so you're probably thinking that you have to read the note and place the wine bottle in the correct slot. It's not much, but it's a thought process of sorts. But you don't even have to do that. Just grab the bottle and place it in the only slot available in the wine rack. I'm convinced one step of the puzzle was deleted here, because otherwise why include the note with Ciri's year of birth? Similarly, there's a missed opportunity with the treasure maps. I remember looking at one map and it had a distinctive tower to help me locate the treasure, so I was all ready to go and hunt it down, and then, well, the marker just automatically got shoved onto my map. I don't want this to sound like I'm criticising hand-holding, because some people will want a game that does the thinking for them, and there is nothing wrong with that. It's just a shame there aren't options for this kind of stuff like there are options for combat. Again, Ubisoft is taking steps in this direction with its new exploration modes that make you work a little harder to pinpoint locations. Another disappointing change from the previous two games, and again it's especially noticeable compared to Witcher 1 and to a slightly lesser extent the second one, is the gear system. In the previous two games it was rare to change gear. There were only a handful of upgrades to make to what Geralt started the game with, and they were expensive. Getting new pieces of armour used to be a big deal, even more so with the swords, and the few upgrades available tended to have special names and significance, such as Erendite, which the Lady of the Lake gave Geralt for completing her questline. This sword was deemed such a big deal that you could import it into the second game. Whenever you were rewarded with a new weapon, you equipped it immediately and you cherished it. This of course ties in nicely with the spirit of the books, where Geralt rarely changes clothes and he treasures his swords. He doesn't need better swords to take on tougher opponents, he needs more knowledge. And Witcher weapons are special. Silver swords designed for killing monsters are rare because generally only Witchers kill monsters, and there aren't many Witchers about. Even Geralt's steel sword is a work of art compared to those used by soldiers or even commanders and kings. Geralt is an old man, he's well travelled, he commissioned the best swords possible and they aren't supposed to be easily replaced. There's even an entire story in the books where Geralt's motivation was to go and get his swords back after they were stolen. Gear in The Witcher 3, however, is everywhere. As with most RPGs, the majority of the gear dropped isn't better than what you already have and should be either ignored or picked up to sell at the first opportunity, although early on there are moments when you find random soldiers or even bandits with better swords than Geralt. Chests often include either a good piece of gear or a blueprint to make a good piece of gear, and these chests aren't just rewards at the end of a lengthy dungeon, they can be found pretty much anywhere. If you see a group of bandits, there is probably a chest with something half decent in it. There are special guarded treasure locations on the map that typically need you to defeat a high level monster, although just as often you can actually open the chest without killing or fighting the monster in question. Even if you don't find any of this stuff in the wild, you can of course buy weapons and armour or the blueprints for weapons and armour from the blacksmiths in each town. Those blacksmiths will also craft gear for you, and generally you don't need a lot of materials or money for this. I admittedly was perhaps a little more thorough than the average player might be when it comes to picking stuff up, but even so you'll be able to craft most of what you need. Gear is level gated, so what will likely happen is you'll reach a new level and equip the best thing you have or can craft, and then stick with that until you level up again. Bearing in mind you will probably level up 30 times during the course of the game, if not more, you can see you'll be changing your gear a lot. Armour also comes in light, medium and heavy variety, so at each level you will likely have at least 3 choices. I dislike the way gear is so disposable because the world of The Witcher is not one with abundant riches. It's a world where you're supposed to look after your shit. Worst of all though, the game occasionally makes a big deal of rewarding you for quest completion with big important swords that have special names and histories dating back hundreds of years, and then you check them out and they're worse than the gear you currently have equipped because they are tied to the recommended level for the quest, which you'll likely be above, and so you end up shoving it straight in your stash, or selling it and never thinking about it again. Fortunately I wasn't undertaking quests just for these rewards, but it was a bit annoying that my big gift from Crack on Crate was a sword that I was never going to use. Kind of felt like he'd ripped me off a bit, to be honest. He handed over Winter's Blade with a great deal of care, describing how it was forged in Mahakam with dragon fire and all that, and of course it was worse than what I already had. This happened a lot. I undertook a lengthy quest for an armourer who promised me a decent set of gear, and it wasn't worth wearing. I tended to keep this special gear anyway because I didn't need the money from selling it and I considered it like a memento of sorts. The difference in how gear is treated between the first two games and this third entry is stark, but this third entry also features a huge open world and it has to adjust accordingly. CD Projekt Red stated that it was keen to follow the 30-second rule in its open world, so there needed to be stuff everywhere for players to stumble upon. Hence the guarded chests, bandit camps, monster nests, etc. However, I would question the need for these spots to include whole pieces of gear. My quick fix suggestion would be to remove all remotely decent gear from the world so you can't find anything better than what you would expect to find on a given enemy type. The hardest to access chests should be limited to blueprints, and then other points of interest would be limited to crafting materials. In other words, you'd have to craft any half decent armour or weapons, with the exception of the special items you might get from completing quests. I'd also increase the amount of materials you need to craft that gear, however that's just tweaking numbers. I'm curious how many of you found the distinction between light, medium and heavy gear all that useful. The difference is noticeable but not especially interesting. Heavy armour gives you more protection at the cost of slower stamina regeneration, it's pretty simple. You'd be well advised to pick an armour weight and stick with it because there are skills that buff stats based on the kit you're wearing, and it's a waste to unlock all three skills. I wouldn't personally say though that changing armour type feels like you're playing a different build, but if you feel differently let me know, because my other suggestion to improve the gear situation is to replace 3 different types with just one to keep the amount of gear a little lower. For my playthrough here I really wanted to retain some of that special feeling around gear and I didn't want to equip new stuff every 5 minutes, so I enforced a rule on myself. Once these special Witcher gear sets were available I wouldn't wear anything else. I picked the feline set from the School of the Cat because, well, it looks cool, I prefer to wear light gear, and I love cats. There are 4 different levels of each set of Witcher gear, so you have to wait until you can upgrade to a new set. For the feline gear I couldn't build the first set until level 17, and then I upgraded at 23, 29 and 35. These special gear sets are pretty good, so for about half the time I had good gear, but as I got closer to the upgrade levels I did find there was a lot of better gear that I had to ignore to keep with my self-imposed rule. It was worth it though. Those upgrades felt special and it probably limited some resource gathering that I might have otherwise done if I'd constantly been crafting and equipping higher level gear. You don't necessarily have to go with the feline gear, but I do recommend picking a set of gear and only wearing that. Being able to ignore so much loot, which often fills up your inventory leaving you over encumbered, is frankly a relief. Having these special gear sets also leads to some cool moments, such as when another Witcher comments on what Geralt is wearing, which is not something that happens when wearing random pieces. A slight annoyance is that even though you're told you need to be, say, level 29 to get the gear blueprints, that's rarely actually the case and you can typically find the blueprints near the entrance of a cave or hideout instead of having to earn it. It wasn't uncommon for me to get a level 35 blueprint just by killing a couple of low level drowners, although of course I couldn't equip it until I was level 35. Speaking of ignoring huge chunks of the game, this time around I didn't play any Gwent apart from the mandatory game early on and one later as part of a quest. That said, I have played a lot of Gwent in my time. Back in my original 2015 playthrough I was going for the Platinum Trophy and therefore needed to collect all the special Gwent cards, which in turn meant playing a lot of Gwent. I never did get that Platinum Trophy mind you because one of the easy bronze ones bugged out and after that I lost the will to keep going. As a game that's just a small part of a bigger game, Gwent is excellent. I can't think of a better mini-game that's been created just to mess around with in-game. I know the Yakuza series has some great mini-games, but most of them are actual games imported into the game as far as I know. The level of complexity and depth for an optional piece of side content is simply remarkable. I loved it so much that I bought the physical card sets, which are gorgeous by the way. I don't believe CD Projekt Red spent as much time as it did on Gwent knowing it would be spun off into its own thing. I think they genuinely made it as a side activity and were surprised at how popular it ended up being. But boy was it popular, and it is now a separate card collection game, and a fairly impressive one at that, while also being a core part of the excellent and underappreciated Thronebreaker game. And that's kind of the problem with playing this version of Gwent now. There are better versions out there. I haven't played much of the separate card game, but I played a lot of Gwent within Thronebreaker, and that one is simply a lot more fun. Perhaps if you get into the meta or play competitively, the version within Witcher 3 could be considered the best, however I doubt it. When I played Gwent back in 2015 I put together a relatively simple deck and applied some basic tactics that let me win every game. I can't remember the exact details, but it involved stocking up on cards that buffed other cards, and then like going all out in the first round, throwing the second round, and then winning the third. I didn't need any special rare cards or anything like that. It was an easy set to build and saw me through even the toughest tournaments. Anyway, sitting down to play loads of Gwent, not to mention entering fist fighting tournaments and horse races, just didn't feel in the spirit of this playthrough. Even though I completed every side quest and monster contract, I did so while role-playing as Geralt, and tried to stick to that spirit. Obviously the main quest to find Ciri was important, although as discussed she can largely look after herself. A lot of the more time-consuming side quests involved helping friends, and the ones that didn't, plus the monster contracts, were just really Geralt doing his job as a Witcher. Entering a fist-fighting tournament that he would easily win because of his mutations felt wrong. I also remembered how you could basically break the economy by betting in those side games in Witcher 2, and I didn't want to do that this time around. To be fair, Geralt does dabble with a card game in the books, although it isn't Gwent. It's called Barrel and seems to be the game of choice for dwarves. I was so determined to avoid all the pointless distractions that I even paid off a fairly hefty debt instead of winning a quick horse race. Even 5 years after release, The Witcher 3 does have a fair few bugs and glitches. However, if you've heard people describe The Witcher 3 as broken or like a Bethesda game, well, I'd take that with a pinch of salt. I've played for hundreds of hours in total across 2 different platforms, and a lot of that time was before patches. It's really not that bad. I didn't experience anything that broke a quest line or required me to go back to an older save, although I don't doubt that has happened to some people. Still, in general, I think part of the criticism around bugs is just the inevitable pushback you get when a thing is popular. Not everyone is going to like every game, and as I've shown in this video, it does have a lot of flaws. But you know what the internet is like, you don't have an opinion worth listening to unless your opinion is at one extreme end. Now with that said, there are a fair few bugs, and given how much money The Witcher 3 has made, you could reasonably argue that CD Projekt Red should have fixed them all, or at least the vast majority. The most famous series of glitches in the game involves Geralt's horse, Roach. He's kind of a mess. You often find him in all sorts of physically impossible positions, although I never had the extreme situations that I've seen online, like him being on top of a house. It's a shame really, because the devs clearly put a lot of work into Roach. I love how if you stop in a small town he typically finds the nearest trough and hangs out there until you're ready. But yeah, it's understandable that he has become the butt of jokes. I still see pictures of weird Roach popping up online. The bug I'm most disappointed about happened during a boss fight against Caranthir. I struggled on this fight a bit back in 2015 and I remember it being a fairly long encounter. This time however, well, it went a bit quicker. Everything else was far less significant. The cat potion stopped working at one point, which was kind of ironic because about 5 minutes beforehand I'd just made a note about how pointless it was. Then it broke and I kind of wanted to use it. Some vendors become unresponsive. One herbalist refused to speak to me after the first visit, and the blacksmith here wouldn't talk to Geralt when he was sitting down. This isn't normal, you can usually interact with them when they're doing something else. I had to meditate to make him assume a new position and then talk to me. Cutscenes can also be a little rough. Hair has a tendency to flicker around all over the place, or in some cases it doesn't pop in at all until slightly later. Ciri would regularly grab her sword without actually grabbing her sword, and cutscenes show events like this thief dropping down to a lower level only for the same thing to be repeated when we take control again. A common problem throughout the series is that sometimes music is too loud during cutscenes, and this happens again here, although it is less of a problem than before.
The gods and the clans, a new ruler takes the crown. Let us created the mask, and the envious seas swallowed his beloved. Unable to...
On a very minor note, boats continue to take damage if they get stuck somewhere. There are floating assets and general weird glitches with NPCs and enemies, such as sirens continuing to be on fire even when underwater, or beasts freezing in mid-flight. A couple of times my decoction stopped showing up in my quick slot selection, and a lot of the traps set by Letho don't seem to actually work. I'm not 100% sure this is a glitch, but every time I fought fiends they seem to bug out and keep going in circles in response to my dodging from side to side. Also probably not a bug as such, but going from water to land is annoyingly awkward at times. It's at these moments that you become very aware of how limited Geralt's ability to interact with the environment is. Again, I never experienced any game breaking or quest breaking bugs, and I think a lot of people exaggerate when they talk about how buggy this game is. That said, there shouldn't be any major bugs still left in the game after 5 years and, more importantly, tens of millions of copies sold. For that reason, I'd also argue that some very obvious flaws should have been fixed, like how when trading you can't exchange goods of equal value. Say you want to buy a sword for 400 gold, but you only have 100 gold. You have 400 gold worth of goods to sell, but the merchant only has 200 gold to buy them. You'd think you could just exchange the items, but instead there's nothing you can do. You can't sell and you can't buy. You have to go to another merchant who has enough gold, sell the goods there, and then come back to the other merchant to buy his stuff. There are 1 or 2 areas that show signs of being a touch rushed compared to the quality of the rest of the game. For example, the boat you visit as part of the Last Wish quest has a lot of low resolution assets, and maybe a few missing textures. While I think that some people do exaggerate their opinions for effect, I can completely understand why this game that I love more than any other is not everyone's cup of tea. As discussed, I don't think the combat stands on its own as being particularly fun. There are certainly many better games out there if all you want to do is swing a sword, and even if you do enjoy a great story, well, maybe this one just doesn't click for you. I consider myself a story guy, as you can probably tell from all the time I spent banging on about it in this video, and yet it's not like I love every story heavy game. I'd say most JRPGs are story heavy, and yet I don't like that type of storytelling, and therefore the genre rarely clicks with me. If the writing and characters here don't click with you, then yeah, this probably feels like another mediocre open world game, and the constant praise it gets likely bugs you. As someone who cannot understand the fascination with Breath of the Wild, I can assure you I know the feeling. I don't get why people are so attached to a big empty world with no meaningful characters or story, but clearly there is something there I'm missing. I loved Witcher 3 when I first played it, and I love it now. It's hard to believe it's almost as old as a typical console generation, and yet it barely feels dated at all. The Witcher 3 is going to age better than the offspring of Kylie Minogue and Keanu Reeves. The only thing that's a bit old hat is the minimap and general HUD, but more recent games like Red Dead Redemption 2 have committed similar crimes against gaming. The Witcher 3 is still an incredible game, and replaying it has me looking forward to Cyberpunk 2077 more than ever before. Alright, that is it on The Witcher for now. Obviously a video on the DLC is on the way. It might not be the next video, but it's not far off. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting like and subscribing if you haven't already. Also, it'd be great if you could share the video so that other people see it before Joseph Hansen makes this video utterly irrelevant. And of course, let me know what you thought in the comments. I do have a Patreon too if you'd like to go the extra mile and support these videos financially and get your name in the credits for $1 a month. And there's a Discord server that is open to all. I do a lot of game giveaways in the Discord server, so you should definitely join if you can. In addition to the Witcher 3 DLC video, I am also continuing my series on isometric CRPGs with Shadowrun and Divinity Original Sin the next ones up. Plus you can expect more Splinter Cell, more Star Wars, and a few surprises along the way. Okay, until next time, cheers.